The high desert outside Bitter Willow held its breath just past 12 o'clock. Silence at the Lone Spur Ranch wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical weight. A heavy blanket Jonah Rourke pulled over himself every night. It was the sound of alkali dust settling on the porch, the distant sigh of his horses shifting in the corral, the dry tick of the cooling stove. It was the sound of a life deliberately emptied, a penance paid in solitude. Jonah sat at his raw plank kitchen table. The lamp burned low. A cup of cold coffee untouched at his elbow. He hadn't slept properly in years, not since the war. The war had taken his brother, Matthew, and spat Jonah out, a Confederate scout with eyes that had seen too much and a silence that wouldn't leave him. Now he ranched horses, preferring their simple company to the complicated betrayals of men. Then the silence broke. It wasn't loud. It was 3 sharp, impossibly close raps on his front door. Tap, tap, tap. Not the friendly knock of a neighbor, nor the heavy fist of the law. This was short, urgent, the sound of knuckles hitting wood with a desperate, final energy. Jonah didn't move for a full 10 seconds. No one came to the Lone Spur, especially not after dark. His hand went, not to his hip, but to the Spencer rifle resting against the wall, its metal cool and familiar. He rose without making a sound, his stockinged feet gliding over the worn floorboards. He stood beside the door, listening. Only the wind answered, scraping tumbleweed against the cabin. "Who's there?" His voice was rough, a rusted hinge. A pause, then a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "Please help me." It was a woman. That alone was wrong. This was no place for a woman. He held the rifle in his left hand, and with his right, he lifted the heavy iron bar securing the door. He eased it back, the metal groaning in protest, and pulled the door open just 6 inches, keeping his body behind the solid oak. The high desert wind lunged at him, a sudden, cold slap. It smelled of sage and distance, and it carried a fine, stinging powder of sand that instantly coated his tongue. In the narrow slit of darkness, she was more shadow than person, a shape, huddled and shaking, wrapped in a heavy traveling cloak that was soaked through, though it hadn't rained in a month. He could see the pale, rain-streaked oval of her face, eyes wide and luminous with terror, lips a pale, bloodless blue. She shivered so hard her teeth chattered, a tiny, desperate sound against the howl of the wind. She looked past him, into the meager warmth of his cabin, her gaze frantic. "Please," she whispered, the word torn from her. "Please don't send me back." Jonah Rourke's instincts, honed by 4 years of tracking men who didn't want to be found, flared to life. He opened the door wider, grabbing her arm to pull her from the night. His hand clamped down not on the wet wool of her cloak, but on her wrist beneath it. He felt the unmistakable, raw ridges of chafed skin, the deep, angry marks left by a rope. She stumbled over the threshold, a small bundle of misery and fear. He shut the door quickly, the wind fighting him, and dropped the heavy bar back into its brackets with a definitive, hollow thud. In the dim, unsteady lamplight, he finally saw her. She was young, maybe 25. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, escaping in wet ringlets from a bonnet that had been torn from its moorings. Her face was ashen, cheeks hollowed by exhaustion. But it was the details that his scout's eye snagged on, the things that didn't fit. Her wrists, where he'd grabbed her, were raw and purpled. The hem of her skirt, visible beneath the dark cloak, was caked not with the black, loamy soil of his ranch, but with the distinctive, rusty red dust of the Thorn Basin, a good 12 miles east. And then the strangest detail of all. The high collar of her dress was ripped at the seam, and someone had stitched it back together, badly. The stitches were huge, panicked, and made with a strand of bright, almost garish, blue thread. It was the kind of thread used for fancy embroidery, not mending a work dress. It looked wrong. It looked like it was hiding something. He didn't move toward her. He stood by the door, his mind cataloging, assessing. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice flat. The woman. Rosamond Hale, though he didn't know her name yet, couldn't seem to catch her breath. She leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to her chest, the other clutching something at her breast. She looked back at the door, as if she could see through the thick wood. They're coming," she gasped. Jonah's gaze flicked to the window. He hadn't drawn the curtains. He stepped past her, moving to the edge of the glass, squinting into the darkness. His ranch was set against a low mesa, giving him a clear view of the basin below. For a moment, he saw nothing but the wind-whipped greasewood. Then, on the low ridge that marked the start of the trail to Thorn Basin, he caught it. Moonlight, brief and cold, flashed off a bit of metal, a rifle barrel. His eyes narrowed. He traced the line down. There were 2 horses standing stock still, silhouetted against the slightly less black sky. They were too far away to see the riders, but he didn't need to. They had stopped there. They had watched her run to his light, the only light for 20 miles. And now, they were waiting. They weren't retreating. They were waiting for daylight, or for him to make a mistake. He turned back to the woman. She had watched his face, had seen the confirmation of her fears. The last bit of strength seemed to drain from her, and her knees buckled. "They say I did it," she choked out, sliding down the wall until she was a heap of wet wool on his floor. She looked up at him, her eyes drowning in a fear so profound it was almost madness. "They say I killed my husband." The accusation hung in the air, heavier and more dangerous than the storm outside. Jonah froze. A murderer. He had given sanctuary to a killer. His first instinct was to throw the bar back, to cast her out into the night and let the men on the ridge deal with her. His life was quiet. He had buried his past, his violence, his sins. He would not have it dug up by a pale, shivering woman with rope burns on her wrists and a killing on her soul. He hesitated. The silence stretched, broken only by her ragged breathing and the wind's low moan. He knew the hunted. He had been the hunted. His gray uniform a target for every Union patrol in Tennessee. And he had been the hunter, his own eyes scanning ridges for silhouettes, his own rifle flashing in the moonlight. He knew what a person looked like when they were running for their life, and he knew what a person looked like when they were running from a lie. She looked like both. The wind screamed through a crack in the window frame, a high-pitched, mournful sound. It sounded like it was whispering a warning. No mercy. Jonah's jaw tightened. He remembered that feeling. He remembered standing in the smoke-filled doorway of a burning barn in Georgia, the heat scorching his face, the screams of his younger brother, Matthew, trapped inside. He had been too late, too slow. He had failed the one person who trusted him. He had shown himself no mercy for that failure, and he expected none from the world. Looking at the woman huddled on his floor, he saw not a killer, but a ghost, another one he was about to fail. With a curse muttered under his breath, he made his decision. "Get up," he ordered, his voice sharp. She flinched. "Get up," he repeated, softer this time. He reached down and hauled her to her feet. She was light as a bundle of sticks. He pushed her toward the kitchen table. "Sit." He moved with a sudden, coiled energy. He strode to the stove and, with a practiced hand, used the poker to damp the fire, killing the flames until only a dull, red glow remained. The cabin was plunged into near total darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight spilling through the window. She sat where he'd told her, her hands trembling so violently on the table that they looked like fluttering birds. Something fell from her grasp and hit the wood. A small, dented silver locket. It spun twice, then lay still. Jonah picked it up. It was old, tarnished, with a deep indentation, as if it had been struck by something hard. He flipped it open with his thumb. Inside, there was no miniature portrait, no lock of hair, only a tiny, tightly rolled scrap of paper. yellowed and stained.
"Water,"
the woman rasped, her eyes fixed on the locket in his hand.
"Please,
Jonah turned, scooped a dipper of water from the bucket by the sink, and handed it to her. Cup and all. Her fingers fumbled as she tried to take it. The metal cup slipped, striking the edge of the wooden table with a sharp clack. In the pressurized silence, the sound was as loud as a gunshot. It was an alarm, a signal of their presence. Both of them froze, listening. The wind howled, mocking them.
"Forgive me,"
she whispered, finally getting the cup to her lips and drinking in desperate, gulping swallows. "Don't matter," Jonah said, his back to her as he moved to the window. He pulled the heavy burlap curtains shut, plunging the room into absolute black. He moved by memory, sliding the heavy bolt on the back door, checking the latch on the root cellar trapdoor. He returned to the front of the cabin, picked up his Spencer, and leaned it against the wall by the door, right where his hand could find it. Every action was economical, practiced, tactical. The rancher was gone. The scout was back. The woman had finished the water. The shaking had subsided, replaced by a dull, exhausted dread. "They'll be here at first light," she said, her voice hollow. "The sheriff, Pike Alderman. He's with him, with Deacon Bragg." Jonah knew the names. Everyone in Bitter Willow knew them. Alderman was the law, a mean, lazy man who enjoyed the power of his badge. Silas Bragg was the money, a railroad man pushing the Western Meridian line through the basin, buying up land for pennies on the dollar, whether the owners wanted to sell or not. The law and the money, riding together. A posse that couldn't be argued with. "They'll come at dawn," she repeated, as if trying to convince herself it was real. Jonah moved to the one window he hadn't covered, the one facing north, away from the ridge. He peered out at the sky. The clouds that had let the moonlight through were thickening, swallowing the few stars that had been visible. A storm was building. It would hide the cabin, and it would hide the tracks. "You stay the night," he said, his voice a low rumble. He still hadn't looked at her with anything like kindness. He was a man offering a tool, not a hand. "You're in that chair. You don't make a sound. You don't light that lamp. Come morning, we'll figure the rest come morning." Jonah did not sleep. He sat in the chair opposite the woman, his Spencer rifle laid across his knees, and watched the burlap curtain. He listened to the storm build, a high, thin wail that covered any sound of approach. The woman, Rosamond Hale. She had finally whispered, eventually succumbed to an exhausted, shivering sleep, her head slumping onto the table. He waited for the gray light, the false dawn that bleeds the color from the world before the sun truly rises. It was the hour of the scout, the hour of ghosts. When the outline of the window frame became sharp against the dark wall, he stood. He moved with a liquid quiet, easing the iron bar from the door and slipping outside. The air was knife-sharp, colder than the night had promised, and smelled of wet sand and ozone. The wind had scrubbed the ground, but not enough to erase everything. His well was 30 yards from the cabin. Near the trough, where the ground was still damp, he saw them. 2 sets of shod hoof prints, deep and clear, pressed into the alkali mud. They were fresh, punched clean through the light layer of dust the wind had left. They were not his, and they were not hers. The men from the ridge had come down. They had circled his cabin, close enough to smell his chimney smoke, close enough to test his nerve. Jonah's eyes scanned the ground, his body low. He followed the tracks, not back toward the ridge, but east, toward a stand of gnarled, ancient juniper trees that provided the only real cover on this side of the ranch. The tracks were slow, walking, a hunter's pace. He found the spot easily, a natural depression in the rock, screened by the low, sweeping branches of the largest juniper. From here, a man had a perfect, clear view of Jonah's front door, his well, and his corral. The men hadn't just waited on the ridge, they had taken up position. and they had left a message. Half hidden in the sand lay a small cylinder of brass, winking a dull gold in the growing light. He picked it up. A casing. He didn't need to read the stamp. He knew the size, the weight. A 45-70. A big round, meant for buffalo or men, fired from a Sharps or a government rifle. He turned it over. The primer was dented. It was spent. He sniffed the opening. The sharp, acrid tang of burnt black powder was still fresh, barely scoured by the wind. They had fired it last night, while he and the woman sat in the dark. A warning, a declaration. He palmed the casing, the metal still holding a faint trace of warmth, and walked back to the cabin, his face hard as desert rock. He barred the door and turned. She was awake. Rosamond Hale sat exactly where she had fallen asleep, her back ramrod straight, her hands knotted in her lap. The terror of the night had receded, leaving a bruised, hollow-eyed exhaustion. The gray light from the window was merciless, revealing the geography of her fear. Jonah's eyes fixed on her throat. Last night, in the dark, he had seen only the pale oval of her face. Now, he saw the mark. It was not the thin, deep line of a hangman's noose. It was a wide, flat abrasion, an angry red welt mixed with purple bruising that circled her neck just below the jawline. It was raw, a friction burn, as if a thick, flat strap had been used to restrain or silence her. He'd seen marks like it once before, on a man who'd gotten tangled in the logging sleds up at the Redwater Mill. A specific kind of injury from a specific kind of rope. He said nothing, just held her gaze. Rose saw him looking. Her hand flew to her neck, a bird trying to cover its nest. The touch made her wince, and her eyes filled with a fresh, hot shame. He did this, she whispered, her voice cracking. One of Mr. Bragg's men, while the sheriff watched. The confession hung in the room, chasing the last of the cold night air away. She fumbled at her breast, her fingers finding the dented silver locket. With trembling thumbs, she sprung the catch. Jonah stepped closer. He laid the heavy brass casing on the table. It rolled once, then settled next to her hand. A stark contrast, the evidence of his threat, the evidence of hers. She didn't unroll the tiny scrap of paper. She pushed the locket across the table to him. Jonah picked it up. His rough fingers, used to horse tack and rifle triggers, were surprisingly gentle as he coaxed the paper open. It was brittle, stained with what looked like sweat or water. It was a torn page, not from a book, but from a business ledger. The top was printed Western Meridian Rail Company, ledger number 3. Below that, just 2 lines of spidery, hurried script. Item, Dynamite Coyote cut line paid. Authorized Silas Bragg. The signature was bold, an arrogant black slash across the page. Jonah had seen that signature before, on notices posted in town, on deeds of sale, on the eviction papers served to his neighbors. My husband, Rose said, her voice flat, as if reciting a lesson she had learned by heart. His name was Abel Hale. He was a foreman for the line. Jonah looked up from the paper. He's gone? 3 days now? She swallowed, her gaze drifting to the empty fireplace. They called it an accident, a dynamite accident, at the quarry. Said he was careless. She leaned forward, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity, a desperate need to make him understand. It wasn't an accident, Mr. Rourke. Abel, he wasn't a brave man, but he was a good one. He found out what they were doing, what Bragg was planning. Jonah waited. He knew the railroad was squeezing the basin, but the how had always been a mystery. The water, she whispered. It's always the water. Bragg needs the land clear through the Mesa Verde. The settlers won't sell. Their wells are deep. So he was going to break them. Abel found the orders. They were using the railroad's dynamite, small charges, to crack the bedrock, to collapse the artesian wells, one by one, make it look like the drought. make it look like God's will. Then, when they were ruined, Bragg would ride in and buy their land for nothing. The 4570 casing on the table suddenly felt heavier. This was more than a land grab. It was war. Abel was going to tell, Rose continued, her voice trembling. He took that page. He was going to ride to the territorial capital, but they found out. Sheriff Pike. He came to our house with 2 of Bragg's men. Her story tumbled out. Fragmented, sharp-edged. Pike hadn't come to arrest Abel. He'd come to talk. But the talk turned sour. One of the men grabbed Abel. She screamed. The other man, the one with the logger's hands, grabbed her. He wrapped a strap around her throat, silencing her, pulling her back against the wall, forcing her to watch. Pike just stood there. She choked. He told Abel to give back the paper. Abel refused. So they ended him, right there, on our floor. She was shaking now, deep, uncontrollable tremors. And then Pike, he turned to me. He said it was a shame, a domestic quarrel gone wrong. He said everyone knew I had a temper, that I was jealous of the women in town. The frame-up was complete, vicious, simple, and clean. They were going to finish me, she gasped, her hand still at her throat. Make it look like I couldn't live with what I'd done. But I had my sewing shears. I cut the man holding me. I ran. I just ran. I grabbed my cloak, and I ran. Jonah's eyes dropped to the hem of her dress, to the detail that had snagged his attention last night. The crude, hasty stitches, the bright blue thread, so out of place. The thread, he said, his voice quiet. Rose looked down, confused. What? The blue thread on your collar. It's the same. He pointed to the hem of her skirt. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in sudden, sharp recollection. Abel, when he gave me the ledger page, he gave me this, too. He said, if they get the paper, they can't get the map. He made me sew it into my skirt. I used the only thread I had. She grabbed the hem, her fingers, still numb and clumsy, fumbled with the thick wool. Here, Jonah said. He pulled a small skinning knife from the sheath on his belt and, with 2 quick movements, sliced the blue threads. He pinched the fabric and something heavy, metallic, fell into his palm. It was not a map. It was a railroad spike. But it was wrong. It was smaller than a standard tie spike, and the head was flat, with numbers and a letter stamped into the steel 40.12Z. A coordinate. Jonah breathed. He'd seen them used by the railroad surveyors. It wasn't just a random number. It was a location. The what was in the ledger. This was the where, the location of the dynamite cache. Before either of them could speak, a shadow fell across the room. It was not the shadow of a cloud. It was sharp, defined. A man on a horse, sitting on the ridgeline not 50 yards from the cabin. Jonah moved instantly, pushing Rose away from the table, pulling her down behind the solid log wall of the cabin. He grabbed his Spencer, his thumb automatically cocking the hammer. Is it them? Rose whispered, her face pressed to the rough wood. No, Jonah said, his eyes squinting at the figure. It's just one man, and he's not hiding. The rider just sat there, perfectly still, his horse a dark statue against the now brightening eastern sky. He wasn't the law, and he wasn't a railroad man. He wore a long canvas duster, and his hat was pulled low, its brim so wide it shadowed his entire face. He sat his horse not like a man riding, but like a hawk balanced on a branch, patient and utterly lethal. He raised one gloved hand, not in a wave, but as if to show it was empty. Then, he nudged his horse forward, walking it slowly down the slope toward the ranch. He didn't approach the cabin, but angled toward the main gate post of the corral, 100 feet away. Jonah watched him through a crack in the shutters. He could see the man's rifle now, a Winchester in a scabbard, worn and oiled. The stock, visible just above the leather, had a design carved into it. a coiled rattlesnake. The man stopped at the gatepost. He reached into his duster and pulled out a piece of paper. With a flick of his wrist, he produced a knife, and with a single, fluid motion, he drove the point of the knife through the paper and deep into the wooden post. The thwack of the blade embedding itself was loud in the morning air. He gathered his reins, turned his horse in a tight, clean circle, and rode away, back toward the ridge. He never once looked back. He did not run. He simply moved, a piece of the desert detaching itself and rolling away. Jonah and Rose waited until he was a small dot on the horizon. "Stay here," Jonah commanded. He unbarred the door and walked, rifle in hand, across the yard. The wind whipped his hair. He reached the post. It was a wanted poster. The ink was still fresh. Wanted Rosamond Hale for the murder of Abel Hale. Below, a reward, $80 alive, $40 dead. It was signed by Sheriff Pike Alderman, Bitter Willow County. The knife holding it was a fine one, balanced, with a bone handle. Jonah wrapped his hand around the grip and yanked it free. He held the poster, the paper flapping violently in the wind. That rider was Lyle Creed, a bounty hunter, a man who worked for paper, not for justice. He walked back to the cabin. Rose stood in the doorway, her face white. He handed her the poster. She read it. Her hand went to the rope burn on her neck. $40, she whispered. That was the price Bragg and Pike had put on her permanent silence. Jonah tore the poster from her hand, crumpled it into a tight ball, and threw it into the cold ashes of the stove. "They don't just want you gone," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "They want you silent. They want you dead, with your name ruined." He looked at her, his eyes clear and hard. He had offered her one night, but the men on the ridge, the casing in the juniper, the ledger in his pocket, and the poster on his gate, they had all changed the arithmetic. This was his land. They had brought their war to his door. Rose looked at the crumpled paper, then at Jonah. The terror that had governed her for 3 days finally broke, replaced by a cold, sharp anger that glittered in her eyes. "I am done running," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "He killed my husband. He put a rope on my neck, and he put my name on that paper. I am done running." Jonah nodded once. The scout's mind was already working, plotting a new course. "We can't stay here," he said. "Creed is a dog on a scent. Pike has the law. Bragg has the money. We have this." He tapped the ledger page, which he'd folded and put in his own shirt pocket. "It's not enough." "What do we do?" "We get proof," Jonah said. "We need someone to look at that mark on your neck, someone official, someone who can stand up in a court and say it's not a suicide mark. It's an attack." "Who?" "There's a doctor over at Sagebrush Ferry. Alma Finch. She's stubborn. She doesn't scare." He grabbed a canvas sack from a peg. "And we need a bigger law than Pike. The circuit judge. Ernest Vaughn. He's supposed to be in Glass Hollow this week. If Dr. Finch will certify your injuries, and we give Judge Vaughn that ledger page, we might just stand a chance." He looked at her, the first flicker of something other than duty in his eyes. "We ride now." The work was fast, methodical. Jonah moved through his cabin not like a man leaving home, but like a soldier breaking camp. He grabbed a canvas satchel, his motions economical, wasting nothing. Into it went a heavy slab of cold cornbread, wrapped in a cloth, a thick wedge of salt pork, greasy and pale. He filled his canteen from the water barrel, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He turned to Rose. She stood by the door, a ghost in the gray light, still clutching the poster he had torn from her grip. She looked too small for the violence that surrounded her. He pulled a coat from a peg by the door. It was his old leather one, worn smooth as glass at the elbows, the wool lining packed flat. It smelled of dust, horse, and the faint, cold tang of winter metal. "Put this on," he said. It was not a request. She looked at the coat, then at him. Her hands were shaking again, but she diddled with the buttons of her torn dress, her fingers clumsy. Jonah looked away, giving her the dignity of the moment. He went to his gear chest and pulled out a pair of thick, gray wool gloves, the right one stained dark with axle grease. He tossed them onto the table. And those... She slipped her arms into the coat. The sleeves swallowed her hands. The shoulders slumped past her own, the hem falling well below her knees. It was a child wearing her father's armor. The absurdity of it, the terrible vulnerability, settled in Jonah's gut like a cold stone. She pulled on the gloves, folding the long cuffs back. "The horses," he said, grabbing his Spencer. "Stay in the doorway. Watch the ridge." He moved to the corral, his two best Dusty, a solid, dun-colored gelding with a calm eye, and Comet, a nervous, leggy bay mare who had more speed than sense. He trusted Dusty with his life. Comet, he trusted to run. He saddled Dusty for himself, the heavy stock saddle groaning as he cinched it tight. He put his lighter breaking saddle on the mare. As he worked, the sun finally crested the mountains, sending weak, horizontal shafts of light across the basin. The air was sharp, and the dust from the night's wind hadn't settled. It hung in the air like a thin, yellow-gold smoke, a ghost fog that blurred the edges of the world. It was good cover. He led the horses to the cabin. Rose stepped out, pulling the wide-brimmed hat he'd given her low over her eyes. She looked at the mare. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can stay on," she said, her voice small. But the same thread of steel he'd heard earlier was still there. "That'll have to do." He cupped his hands for her boot. She was light, and he almost threw her over the saddle. She righted herself, gathering the reins in her gloved hands, her knuckles white. Jonah mounted Dusty in one smooth motion. He did not look back at his cabin, at the cold stove and the empty chair. He just settled his rifle across his lap, nudged Dusty with his heel, and led the way. Not toward the main trail, but cutting south through a break in his own pasture fence, heading for the broken lands. They rode for the first hour in silence, broken only by the plod of hooves in the thick dust and the jingle of harness. The landscape was a gray-brown smear of sagebrush and broken rock, stretching into an infinity that offered no comfort, no place to hide. They were two small, dark specks on an enormous, empty canvas, and Jonah felt the eyes on his back every second. Pikes, creeds, or just the countries. Out here, they were often the same thing. The silence began to wear. It was worse than the wind, worse than the fear. Rose was the first to break it, her voice thin, carried back to him by the breeze. "My mother, she taught me how to do cross-stitch," she said, startling him. Jonah just grunted, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. She said I had a good eye for color," Rose continued, her words tumbling out as if she needed to fill the awful quiet with something, anything, that wasn't death. "The blue I used on my dress that was for a sampler. The Lord is my shepherd." I was almost finished. She looked down at her gloved hands, clutching the horn of his saddle. I dreamed of having a small shop. In Juniper Crossing. Just a little place, with threads and calico. A notions shop. I had a name for it, the Golden Needle. She gave a short, bitter laugh that was closer to a sob. "Seems like another lifetime now. 100 years ago." Jonah remained quiet. He had no use for dreams. They were just things to be taken from you, one by one, until all you had left was the ground under your feet. But her words, her small, broken dream of calico and thread, chipped a single, tiny piece from the wall he had built around himself. He looked back at her, the oversized coat, the terrified eyes under the brim of his hat. He saw, for the first time, not just a problem he had to solve, but a person. "Dreams get burned," he said, his voice flat. She looked up, startled by the suddenness of his words. He kept his gaze fixed on the trail ahead, but his mind was miles and years away. I had a brother, Matthew, younger than me by 2 years. All he dreamed of was horses. Wanted a big ranch, just like this one, but in Virginia.
Was he in the war?
She asked, her voice hushed. He was, Jonah said. We were acquiring supplies from a Union depot near Atlanta. It was a barn full of hay and grain. He could smell it, even now, the rich, sweet smell of cured hay, and then the acrid stink of smoke, sharp and sudden. It caught fire. A stray shot, maybe one of our own. It went up like a torch. Matthew, he got trapped. Timbers came down, blocked the main door. I was at the side door. I was right there. He stopped. He hadn't spoken these words aloud to any living soul. Dusty, sensing the tension in him, shook his head, the bridle jingling. I could hear him yelling, but I could hear a Union patrol, 2 bugles, not a quarter mile off. I hesitated. He closed his eyes for a bare second. Just a second, just one beat. Worried about the patrol, worried about who was waiting outside. And in that second, the roof went in. He opened his eyes. The desert was sharp and clear, unforgiving. I was a beat slow, and he was gone. I got away. He burned. So you tell me about dreams, Mrs. Hale. I know what they're good for. A heavy, painful silence settled between them, but it was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the ghosts of a notions shop and a burned-out barn. They rounded a high sandstone buttress, and the land fell away into a deep, jagged canyon. This was Dry Knife Gulch. Jonah pulled up, raising a hand. Rose stopped beside him.
What is it?
He pointed, high above them, black specks against the pale blue sky. Vultures, a dozen of them, maybe more. They were circling, a slow, patient vortex over a spot a mile down the gulch. A sign of a carcass, Jonah said, his voice low.
A cow?
Rose whispered, her hand going to her throat. Maybe, Jonah said. Or maybe Lyle Creed leaving a message. Or Pike's men didn't want to waste a bullet on a horse they'd run too hard. Either way, we're not going near it. He turned Dusty, heading not down the gulch trail, but sliding down a steep, sandy embankment into the dry creek bed that snaked along the bottom. The high, sheer walls of the gulch rose on either side, blocking the sun, plunging them into shadow. The sand was deep, muffling their horses' hooves, but it would hide their tracks. The air was dead, still, and smelled of rock and ancient decay. They rode through the oppressive, shadowed quiet for another 2 hours. The high walls felt like a trap, amplifying the sound of their breathing, the creak of the leather. Finally, the gulch widened, spilling them back out onto the sun-blasted flats. Ahead, a cluster of low, adobe buildings shimmered in the heat. It wasn't a town, just a crossing. A small, rope-drawn ferry was tied to the bank of the sluggish, muddy river. Beside it stood a livery stable and a single, low-slung building with a warped sign, Saloon. Sagebrush Ferry. Jonah said, Doctor, Finch keeps a room in the back of the saloon. Stays here 3 days a week. But as they drew closer, Jonah felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The place was too quiet. It was mid-morning. There should have been men, horses, noise. The hitching rail in front of the saloon was empty, save for one horse, a big, powerful bay with a county brand on its flank. Jonah stopped, 20 yards out. Pike's here. Rose's breath hitched. He couldn't know. How could he know? He knows Finch is the only doctor who'd stand against him, Jonah said, his jaw tightening. He's cut us off. He's smart. What do we do? We find out. He swung down from Dusty. Stay on the horse. If it goes bad, you ride. You ride for Glass Hollow and don't stop. No, she said, her voice sharp. She slid off Comet before he could protest. I'm done running. You said it yourself. We get proof. He looked at her, at the small, determined set of her chin under his hat. He gave a single, curt nod. "Stay behind me." He walked toward the saloon, his spurs silent in the dust. He pushed the batwing doors open with his left hand, his right hovering near his hip. The saloon was dark, the air thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and something else, fear. There were 3 ranchers at the bar, their backs to the door, hunched over their glasses. They didn't turn. In a booth near the back, Sheriff Pike Alderman was finishing a plate of eggs. He looked up as they entered, a greasy, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Well, now, Jonah," he boomed, dabbing his mouth with a dirty napkin. "Fancy seeing you here. And you brought my prisoner. Saved me the ride." In a chair against the far wall, a deputy sat, his rifle across his knees. Beside him sat a woman in her 50s, hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face rigid with anger. "Dr. Alma Finch." "What's this, Pike?" Jonah asked, his voice low and flat, his eyes taking in the room. "This," Pike said, gesturing with his fork. "Oh, just official business. Seems Dr. Finch here has been practicing medicine without the proper territorial license. A real shame. We're just holding her, waiting for the magistrate to sort it out." The trap was sprung. He had known Jonah would come for the doctor. He'd cut them off at the pass. And then Jonah saw him. In the darkest corner of the room, a table half hidden by shadow, a man sat there, his duster still on, his hat pulled low, Lyle Creed. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him, but he wasn't drinking. With one gloved finger, he was tapping the rim of the glass, a slow, steady, patient rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't look up, but Jonah knew those unseen eyes were on them. They had hooked them the moment they walked through the door. Creed wasn't with Pike. He was just watching, waiting to see if his bounty was going to be $80 or $40. Rose froze beside Jonah. She had seen Pike, the doctor, and now she saw the man from the ridge. Her breath came in a ragged, silent gasp. This was it. It was over. Jonah felt her begin to tremble, a deep shudder that meant she was about to break, to bolt, or to faint. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Pike, but he moved his right hand, not toward his gun, but to his side. He found her hand, the rough, damp wool of the glove. He put his hand over the back of hers. It was not a gentle, comforting touch. It was firm, heavy, a silent command. "I am here. Do not break. Stand your ground." He felt her shudder stop. For a long second, her hand was just a cold, terrified thing beneath his. Then, her fingers moved. They squeezed his, just a fraction, a small, desperate grip that was an answer, an alliance. "We're leaving, Pike," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "Now, Jonah." "I don't think so," Pike said, starting to push his bulk up from the table. "That woman is wanted for—" They never found out what he was going to say. "From the corner," a new voice cut through the tension. It was a dry, rasping drawl. "She ain't worth $80 till I say she is. Sheriff?" Lyle Creed still hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. He just kept tapping the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Pike froze, his hand halfway to his gun. He wanted Rose, but he did not want to cross Lyle Creed. That was all the time Jonah needed. "The back," he whispered to Rose. He grabbed her arm and pulled her, not running, but walking, his body between her and Pike. They moved past the bar, through a filthy kitchen that smelled of rancid grease, and burst out the back door into the blinding sunlight of the stable yard. "The horses!" Jonah yelled. They ran to where they'd left the animals, but as Jonah grabbed Dusty's reins, he looked at the sky. The clear, pale blue was gone. A solid, churning wall of yellow-brown was rolling in from the north, high and fast, a dust storm. "No time!" he snarled. He vaulted into the saddle and pulled Rose up, seating her roughly in front of him on Dusty. He kicked the horse into a desperate gallop, leaving Comet tied to the rail. They hit the edge of the riverbank just as the first massive gust of wind struck, a physical blow that staggered the horse and stung their faces with sand. They were blind. "We need shelter!" Rose screamed over the howl of the wind. Jonah knew this land. "Crow's Notch. There's a shed." He turned Dusty into the teeth of the storm, the world disappearing into a screaming, brown void. They rode blind, the horse trusting Jonah, Jonah trusting his memory. After a frantic 10 minutes, they stumbled into it, an old, abandoned sledge shed, built by the Redwater Mill loggers. Its roof half collapsed. Jonah half fell from the saddle, pulling Rose with him. He dragged the horse inside just as the full force of the storm hit. The sound was deafening, a roar that blotted out all thought. The rickety shed shook, planks groaning. It was pitch black inside. Jonah fumbled in his saddlebag, his hands raw from the sand, until he found his storm lantern and a match. He struck it, the flame sputtering, and lit the wick. A small, weak circle of yellow light pushed back against the screaming chaos. The temperature had plummeted. The wind found every crack in the shed. They were both shaking, from cold, from fear. Jonah quickly unsaddled Dusty, rubbing him down with a scrap of burlap. He pulled the heavy, greasy horse blanket from his saddle roll. He turned to Rose. She was huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale in the lantern light. He unfolded the blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, luminous, reflecting the tiny flame. She took one side of the heavy wool and, wordlessly, pulled it up and over his shoulders. Two. They stood there, huddled together under the same blanket, the world roaring outside, the lantern light flickering between them. He could feel the warmth of her breath, see the pulse hammering at the base of her throat, just above the angry red mark. Their eyes locked. The fear was still there, a living thing in the small space. But it was no longer the only thing, a thin, vibrating line of trust, forged in the saloon when his hand had covered hers, now connected them. They were no longer a rancher and a fugitive. They were just two people, trapped in the dark, holding the line together. The world outside the shed had ceased to exist. It had been swallowed by a single, deafening roar, a screaming brown void that clawed at the flimsy plank walls. The sound of the wind was a physical thing, a beast trying to break in. Fine. Stinging grit and ice pellets hammered the tin roof in a frantic, irregular rhythm, like 1,000 small hands drumming a desperate beat. The only light was the small, yellow eye of Jonah's storm lantern, hanging from a nail, casting wild, leaping shadows that made the small space seem to contract and expand with every gust. In the corner, the horse, Dusty, snorted, his large body a solid mass of animal warmth, his presence a silent, calming anchor in the chaos. Jonah and Rose sat huddled on the dirt floor, backs against a stack of moldering feed sacks, the heavy, greasy-smelling horse blanket pulled over both their shoulders. It was a meager defense. The cold was a living thing, seeping up from the ground, cutting through the wool. Rose was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her eyes were fixed on the lantern flame, but she wasn't seeing it. She was seeing a room, a man's face, a heavy strap. The angry, purpled rope burn on her neck throbbed in the cold, a phantom pain that mirrored the one in her memory. Jonah watched her. He felt the tremors pass from her shoulder, through the blanket, into his own. It was a current of pure, undiluted fear. He was a practical man, not given to comfort, but this was a problem to be solved. He reached into his saddlebag, which he'd set beside him, and pulled out a long, dark wool muffler. It was dry. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm. "Put this round your neck. It'll keep the drafts out." He moved to help her, to wrap it for her, his hands rough as bark, calloused from rains and iron. came up to her throat. His fingers brushed the high, ripped collar of her dress, the one held together by the stark blue thread. And then, his thumb grazed the raw, abraded skin just below her jawline. He stopped. His hand froze, hovering an inch from her skin. He had seen the mark in the gray light of dawn. But this was different. This was close. In the flickering lantern light, it looked less like an injury and more like a brand, a deliberate, cruel signature left on her. He felt a sudden, unfamiliar surge of cold fury. But beneath it was a deeper instinct, the ingrained respect of a man who understood boundaries, who knew what it was to carry a mark, even if his were all on the inside. He did not want to cause her more pain, more shame. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if burned, and simply held the scarf out for her to take. Rose, who had tensed for the touch, watched his movement. She had expected him to recoil in disgust, or to touch the mark with a grim, clinical pity. He had done neither. He had retreated, not from her, but for her. He had given her space. Her shivering, for a single beat, stopped. She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a savior or a shield, but as a man. His face was hard, carved by wind and loss. His eyes shadowed, but they were steady. They weren't looking at her like she was a murderer, a liar, or a broken thing to be fixed or discarded.
You look at me,
she whispered, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear it over the wind. All day, even in the saloon, you look at me like I'm a person, not someone's sin, not someone's trouble. The words hung in the small, charged space between them, as real as the lantern light. Jonah had no answer for them. He had spent 4 years tracking men and more years since avoiding them. He dealt in actions, in causes and effects. Her words were from a language he had forgotten. She took the scarf from his hand, but she didn't wrap it around her neck. She let it rest in her lap. Then, slowly, as if testing the ice on a frozen pond, she leaned the fraction of an inch that remained between them. Her shoulder, sharp and small, pressed firmly against the solid muscle of his. They sat like that for a long time, sharing the blanket, sharing the silence inside the storm. The only sound was the howling wind, the tapping grit, and the quiet, unified rhythm of their breathing. In, out, slow, and then deeper. The panic began to recede, beaten back not by the shelter, but by the simple, solid contact. Jonah was acutely aware of her, the smell of the high desert rain in her hair, the faint, clean scent of lye soap from her skin. It had been years since he had sat this close to anyone, years since he had offered, or accepted, this kind of simple, shared space. He felt the hard knot of guilt he carried for his brother. Matthew, loosen just a fraction. He raised his right hand, the one that had held the rifle in the saloon. He moved it slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He didn't reach for her hand, or her waist. He brought his hand to her face. He touched her cheek, not with his palm, but with the back of his hand, letting his calloused, rough knuckles graze her skin. It was a touch that asked nothing, that took nothing. It was a touch that simply said, I am here. Rose didn't flinch. She didn't move, her breath catching in her throat. She had been running for 3 days. She had been grabbed, hunted, and threatened. This was the first gentle, human touch she had felt since before Abel's death. A single tear, hot and sudden, escaped her eye and tracked down her cold cheek. She closed her eyes, and with a small, shuddering sigh, she leaned into his touch. She turned her head, pressing her forehead against his, a desperate, silent plea for an anchor in the storm. She held her breath, as if the smallest movement might shatter the fragile moment, as if she were a drowning woman who had finally, impossibly, found a solid shore. He was still, letting her hold on. He could feel her trembling subside, replaced by the thrum of a different energy. He was so close he could see the tiny, dark freckles across the bridge of her nose, the faint scar just above her eyebrow. He tilted his head. The first kiss was soft, barely a press of lips, hesitant, searching. It was a question. Her lips were cold, chapped from the wind, and tasted of dust and salt. She did not pull back. She let out the breath she'd been holding, a small, warm puff against his mouth. And in that breath, she softened. The kiss deepened. It was no longer a question, but a mutual confirmation. You are not alone, neither are you. It was a raw, honest collision, a desperate statement of life in the face of the death that hunted them. It was the shared recognition that, in that shed, in that storm, they were the only two people in the entire world. He pulled back, just enough to speak. His forehead still rested against hers. "Your cloak," he murmured, his voice thick. "It's still damp from last night. You'll catch your death." She nodded, her eyes still closed. He reached for the large horn button at her throat, the one just above the clumsy blue stitches. His fingers fumbled, cold and unaccustomed to such delicate work. He stopped, his knuckles brushing the skin of her neck, just above the rope mark. He looked at her, his eyes asking the question his lips could not form. "May I?" Rose opened her eyes. She saw the respect in his gaze, the fierce control, the permission he was asking for. She gave a single, slight nod. His fingers worked the button free, and then the next, and the next. His movement slow, deliberate. With each button, his knuckles grazed the cotton of her dress beneath. He didn't pull the cloak away, but just opened it, letting the cold air hit her. He pulled back, breaking the contact, and unwrapped the blanket from his own shoulders, leaving it draped entirely over hers. He stood, went to his saddle roll, and untied his bedroll, a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle. He spread it out on the driest part of the floor, a patch of dirt covered in a thin layer of ancient, dry hay. Then he spread the heavy horse blanket on top of it. "Get in," he said, his voice practical, though his breath was still unsteady. "Get under, all the way." She hesitated, then moved to the makeshift bed. She sat, and he knelt in front of her. "Your boots, they're wet." He grabbed the heel of one of her worn, muddy boots and pulled. It was stuck fast, the wet leather clinging to her ankle. He pulled harder, bracing his other hand on her calf. It's stuck," she said, her voice tight with effort as she tried to help him. He gave one final, solid yank. The boot came free so suddenly he almost toppled backward, the boot in his hand. A small, surprised sound escaped Rose. It was a laugh, a tiny, rusty, breathless sound, as if the mechanism for it had forgotten how to work. It was the first time she had laughed in what felt like a lifetime. A rare, faint smile cracked the corners of Jonah's hard mouth. "The other one?" This one came off more easily. He took his own boots off, then motioned for her to lie down. She did, slipping under the heavy wool blanket, still in her dress. Jonah blew out the lantern. The shed was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The sound of the storm seemed to double in volume, a terrifying, impersonal roar. Rose gasped, the blackness pressing in. A moment later, she felt the bedroll dip as he lay down beside her, on top of the blanket. It's too cold," she whispered, her voice trembling. He said nothing. She felt him shift. Then the heavy weight of the horse blanket was lifted, and he was sliding in beside her, pulling the wool up to their chins. They lay side by side, not touching, two rigid forms under a single cover, but the cold was relentless. It seeped in from every side. The small space between them was an icy void. After a long, tense minute, he spoke, his voice a disembodied rumble in the dark. "We'll freeze like this." He rolled onto his side, facing her, and she did the same. The distance was gone. They were pressed together, front to front, from shoulder to knee. The thin cotton of her dress and the rough wool of his shirt were the only things separating them. It was an electric shock of pure warmth. Her cold nose was tucked into the hollow of his shoulder. His arm found her waist, pulling her closer, and her hands, trapped between them, rested flat against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel his heart, a strong, steady drumbeat beneath her palm, hammering against her own frantic, rapid pulse. Heat bloomed, spreading through her limbs, chasing away the cold, chasing away the fear. The storm lantern, which he hadn't fully extinguished, sputtered on its last drops of oil. The wick flared, casting a final, dull purple glow, and then died, leaving them in a profound and total darkness. That last flicker of light was a signal. In the anonymity of the dark, with the storm as their only witness, the restraint broke. He found her mouth again. The kiss was deep, fueled by the cold and the fear and the sudden, explosive relief of warmth. It was a claiming, an anchoring. His hand moved from her waist, sliding up her back, a warm, protective weight pressing her closer, molding her against him through the cloth. Her fingers, no longer cold, curled, gripping his shirt. They shared breath, shared warmth, shared the desperate, unspoken need to be alive. Sincere, broken whispers passed between them in the dark. Names, assurances, "I'm here, don't be afraid." Words that were more feeling than sound. After a long time, the wind, as if finally exhausted, began to quiet. The frantic drumming of the grit on the roof softened, then faded, the roar diminishing to a low, distant moan. The silence that settled over the shed was vast, heavier and more profound than the noise had been. Rose stirred, her voice a shaky whisper against his chest. If I have to face them tomorrow, if they find me," she trailed off, the terror returning. Tonight, I just wanted to feel alive, not like something they were hunting." Jonah held her tighter. His hand moved from her back to her hair, his fingers burying themselves in the damp strands. He held her head steady, his lips close to her ear. "We'll be alive," he said, his voice a low, rough vow in the sudden quiet. "Together." Jonah woke to the smell of wet dust and the faint, clean scent of sage. The world was utterly still, the storm's roar replaced by a profound, cathedral-like quiet. He was on his side, and she was pressed against him, her face tucked into his shoulder, her breathing a slow, even rhythm against his chest. Her hand, which had gripped his shirt in the dark, was now relaxed, resting over his heart. He lay perfectly still, a man trapped not by an enemy, but by a strange, unfamiliar warmth. The night had been a fever dream, a desperate collision in the dark. But the morning was real. The cold light filtering through the cracks in the shed wall was real. The woman breathing against him was real. And the men hunting them were real. He felt her stir, her lashes fluttering against his skin. Her first breath of waking was a small, sharp intake, a gasp of confusion as she found herself against a stranger. She tensed, all the fear of the last 3 days rushing back. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "It's just me. The storm's passed." Rose pulled back, her face flushing crimson in the dim light. She sat up, pulling the heavy horse blanket around her shoulders, her hair a wild tangle. The intimacy of the dark was gone, replaced by a raw, awkward daylight. She started, unable to find the words. Jonah didn't press. He sat up, his back to her, and began pulling on his cold, stiff boots. He was a man of action, and the silence was too heavy. "I'm checking the perimeter. Stay here." He picked up his Spencer and eased the shed door open. The world was new, scoured clean. The wind had died, leaving a sky so clear and blue it hurt the eyes. The air was cold, sharp as glass. He stepped out, his boots sinking into the damp, reddish mud at the mouth of the notch. And he froze. The storm had saved them. It had covered their tracks, hidden them in its roar. but it hadn't wiped the ground clean. In the sheltered entrance to Crow's Notch, where the wind hadn't scoured the earth, the mud was a chaos of tracks, dozens of them, shod horses milling, circling, overlapping. This wasn't just Pike and a deputy. This was a posse. They had been here perhaps only an hour or two ago, sweeping the entire area. Pike wasn't just guessing. He had tracked them to Sagebrush Ferry, and he was combing the land between there and Glass Hollow. They hadn't been saved. They had been given a few hours' reprieve. He walked back into the shed, his face a hard mask. Rose was on her feet, trying to braid her tangled hair with trembling fingers. "He's close," Jonah said, his voice flat. "A dozen men, maybe more. They swept the mouth of the notch. The storm is the only reason they didn't find us." Rose's hand stilled. The color drained from her face, leaving the purple mark on her neck standing out in stark relief. "Then we're trapped." "Not yet." Jonah began to saddle Dusty with grim, efficient movements. "But we can't run blind. We need to know what we're fighting." Rose, galvanized by the immediate danger, moved to his saddlebag. She pulled out the small, dented locket. Her hands were steadier now. She took the tiny, rolled ledger page and carefully unfurled it. They bent over it, their heads close in the dim light, the page resting on the dusty saddle. "Abel, he pointed this out to me," she said, her finger tracing the spidery script. "Here, 50 detonators, and this date." "What about it?" "It's the day the Chamizal well collapsed, Old Man Chamizal's land, south of the basin. Everyone said it was the drought, that the artesian spring just dried up. But Abel said it wasn't right. He said the ground it fell. He said it was a clean break, not a slow drying. 50 detonators, enough to crack the bedrock, to shatter the channels of a deep spring, to murder a man's livelihood and blame it on God. Jonah's gaze wasn't on the amount. It was on the margin. A single, hurried note, written in a different pencil, as if added in a hurry. Just 2 words, Zeebridge. "Zeebridge," Jonah said aloud, tasting the words. "What is it?" "I don't know," Rose said, shaking her head. "Just a note he'd scribbled. A place. Maybe—" Jonah's mind, a map of the territory, flashed. "Coyote Cut," he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "It's not a place. It's a thing. The railroad is building a trestle over Coyote Cut, but it's a deep ravine, 1,000 feet straight down. To move heavy equipment, they had to build a temporary access bridge." He looked at her, his eyes dark. "It switchbacks down one side of the canyon wall and back up the other in a sharp Z shape. The crews, they call it the Z Bridge." But why would he write that? "The Mesa Verde," Jonah said, the pieces falling into place with sickening speed. "The settlers up on the Mesa Verde. Bragg needs their land for the new spur line. But they won't sell. They're supplied from Glass Hollow, by the old freight road. That road, it's the only road. And it crosses Coyote Cut on that bridge." He tapped the ledger page. "Bragg already destroyed their water. Now he's going to cut them off. He blows that bridge. The settlers on the mesa are stranded. No food, no supplies, no way out. He can starve them out before winter." "He's going to isolate them," Rose whispered, her voice thick with horror. "Make them prisoners on their own land." Jonah nodded, his face grim. "He's not just buying land. Rose, he's conquering it, and he's using the railroad's dynamite to do it. We have to stop him. We have to live that long." Jonah countered. He finished cinching the saddle. "We need Alma. We need her testimony. I sent word to a hand I trust at the livery. Told him to get a message to her if he could. Told her to meet us at Salt Cedar Wash if she got clear. It's our only chance." They rode out of the notch, not into the open basin, but into the broken, rocky badlands to the east. Jonah kept them low, using the arroyos and dry washes as cover, his eyes constantly scanning the high ridges, expecting to see the silhouette of Pike's posse. After an hour, he led them into a deep, narrow cut in the sandstone, a dry riverbed known as Salt Cedar Wash. The high red walls protected them from view, the sandy bottom muffling Dusty's hoof falls. She was there. Dr. Alma Finch was sitting on a flat rock, her black medical bag at her feet. A double-barreled shotgun laid across her lap. Her mule was tied to a withered scrub oak. "Took you long enough," she snapped, her gray hair pulled back in a tight, furious bun. "I've been here since sunup." "Alma," Jonah breathed, relief washing over him. "How did you get away?" "Walked," Alma said curtly. "Right out the front door. That half-wit Pike and his deputy were so busy congratulating themselves on their big arrest. They didn't even see me leave. Practicing without a license. I've been setting bones in this county since before Pike could grow whiskers. Now, let's see this child." She motioned to Rose. "Get down. Let me see your neck." Rose dismounted, her legs shaky, and walked to the doctor. Alma didn't coddle her. She tilted Rose's chin up into the harsh sunlight, her fingers probing the bruised, abraded skin with a firm, professional touch. "Sheriff Pike said I did it," Rose whispered, wincing as Alma's fingers found a tender spot. "He said Abel and I that we fought." Alma let out a snort of pure derision. "Fought, child. This isn't a scratch from a fingernail. This is a flat, wide strap, a cinch, or a logging harness, pulled from behind, and hard, by a man who knew what he was doing. This is a silencing mark, not a fighting mark." Rose looked at Jonah, her eyes wide. "But Abel—" "Ah, yes, Abel," Alma said, her face hardening. She went to her medical bag. "Pike is a fool, but he's a lazy fool. He arrested me after I'd already performed the coroner's examination on your husband. He thought he was stopping me from seeing you. He forgot I'd already seen him." "And?" Jonah asked, his voice tight. "And," the doctor said, "Abel Hale had 2 cracked ribs and a severe fracture at the base of his skull, consistent with being struck from behind with a heavy, blunt object. After that, he was strung up. The ligature marks on his neck were post-mortem. He was already gone." Rose swayed, and Jonah put a hand out to steady her. They beat him," Rose choked out. "And I— "You did nothing, child," Alma said, her voice softening for the first time. "You survived, and now, you've got this." She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her bag. "My official affidavit, as county coroner. It states, in no uncertain terms, that Abel Hale's death was a homicide, and that your injuries are consistent with a violent assault, not a domestic quarrel." Jonah took the paper as if it were spun glass. This was it, a legal anchor, a weapon. "This is it," Rose whispered, tears of relief and grief tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "We can take this, we can—" "Now for the bad news," Alma said, cutting her off. "I wasn't just sitting idle at the saloon. I was listening. Bragg isn't waiting. He's moving the dynamite tonight, a special car, listed on the manifest as maintenance supplies, is being shunted to the Z-Bridge siding just after dark. Pike is to meet him there, to guard the supplies." "He's going to blow the bridge tonight," Jonah said, stating the fact, "while the settlers are sleeping." A sound, a sharp crack and the whine of a ricochet, echoed through the wash. A chip of sandstone exploded from the rock face, a yard above Rose's head, showering them in dust. Jonah reacted without thinking. He shoved Rose against the rock wall, his body covering hers, his Spencer already at his shoulder, aimed at the rimrock above. "Creed!" he yelled. A dry, amused drawl floated down from the rocks. "Mornin', Rourke, Mrs. Hale. You are making my $80 fee an awful lot of work." Lyle Creed's silhouette appeared against the blue sky. He was sitting on his horse, Winchester resting across his lap, looking down on them. "This ain't your fight. Creed!" Jonah yelled, his rifle still trained on the man's chest. "The paper in my pocket says it is." "Rourke," Creed shouted back. "But I'll tell you what. I'm a man who appreciates a fair wage. And I've been thinking, Pike's offer is 80 alive, 40 dead. But a railroad man like Deacon Bragg, a man with a secret that big, I'm betting he'd pay a whole lot more for a woman who just disappears. Permanently. He spat over the edge. I don't like poachers. Rourke. And I don't like a staged scene. Smells bad. I want the real bounty. So I'll wait. I'll just see who's offering the highest price by sundown. Don't make me choose. Rourke, it's bad for business. His shadow pulled back, and he was gone. Rose was shaking violently, her face pressed into Jonah's shirt. He's just waiting to see who pays more. He's got his own code, Jonah said, his voice grim as he helped her stand. It's a dark one, but he just gave us a deadline, sundown. He turned to Alma, his mind racing. We have to stop that explosion. We can get to the bridge. Pull the spikes on the siding. Send that whole car into the ravine. He was thinking like a scout again. Like a saboteur. Or just get to the car. Steal the detonators. Stop it cold. No. Jonah and Alma both turned to look at Rose. She had stepped away from the wall. Her face was pale, streaked with dust and tears, but her eyes were burning with a cold, hard fire. No, she repeated, her voice shaking but gaining strength. You don't understand. If we just stop it, they'll find another way. They'll blame us. They'll say we were the ones trying to blow the bridge. Pike will have the whole territory hunting us. It's not enough to stop him. Jonah, we have to expose him. Expose him to who? Jonah shot back. Pike is the law, and Crete is just waiting to sell us to the highest bidder. To the real law, Rose said, turning to Alma. You said Judge Vaughn is in Glass Hollow, the circuit judge. He is, Alma confirmed, catching the thread. He's hearing land disputes at the courthouse all week. Then that's what we do, Rose said, her voice ringing with a conviction that startled them both. We don't just stop the explosion. We stop Bragg. We deliver the evidence, your affidavit, and Bragg himself, straight to the judge. It's a desperate play, Jonah said, pacing. Glass Hollow is 20 miles east. The Z Bridge is 10 miles north. We can't be in both places at once, and Pike has a dozen men. You two can't ride into Glass Hollow, Alma said, thinking fast. You're wanted. Pike will have your poster on every street corner. But me, I'm just an old woman who was wrongfully detained by a fool sheriff. I can ride. Jonah looked at her. Alma, it's the only way, she said, picking up her bag. I'll take the affidavit and the ledger page. She looked at Rose, who handed it to her without hesitation. I'll ride for Vaughn. I'll drag him out of that courtroom by his robes if I have to. But I'll bring him. And us? Rose asked, turning to Jonah. A slow, grim smile touched Jonah's lips. Us. We go to the bridge. We make damn sure Deacon Bragg and his dynamite car keep their appointment. How will we know? Rose asked, looking at Alma. How will we know if you've got him, we'll be at the cut? We can't be seen. Jonah looked up at the high canyon walls, then at the open sky. A signal. The north bank of the cut. It's high, sheer visible from the bridge. If you get the judge, if you can convince him to hold a hearing, right there a Court of the Plains hang a lantern. A white one. Hang it from that big, blasted pine on the north rim. A white lantern, Alma repeated, nodding as she mounted her mule. For justice. I like the sound of that. You two just stay alive until dark. She kicked the mule, heading east at a hard, steady pace, a small, gray-haired woman carrying the weight of their entire future. Jonah turned to Rose. He was no longer a man running. He was a man setting a trap. It's a long shot, he said, his voice quiet. Rose finished braiding her hair and tucked it under his hat. She looked at the trail Alma had taken, then at the high, rocky ridges that led to the Z Bridge. She put her hand on the locket at her throat. It's the only one we have. Night fell on Coyote Cut not as a blanket, but as a shroud. It was a heavy, wet darkness that rose from the 1,000-foot drop of the ravine, clinging to the raw pine of the Z-bridge. The air was cold, carrying the damp, mineral smell of the creek far below. But it was tainted with another, sharper scent. It was the acrid, metallic tang of dynamite, faint but unmistakable. Jonah and Rose had been there for an hour, two ghosts in the skeletal framework of the bridge. They had left Dusty hidden a mile back, in a stand of cottonwoods, and had approached the bridge on foot, moving through the shadows like the hunters they had become. The siding was a short, dead-end track, built precariously on a ledge of rock just before the bridge itself began its switchback descent. A single, dark red boxcar sat on the tracks, a silent, menacing box of death. Rose moved with a confidence that surprised Jonah. She slipped between the massive support beams of the bridge's scaffolding, her hands finding holds in the dark, her feet sure on the narrow planks. "Abel, he used to bring me," she whispered, her voice a breath of air in the vast quiet. "He'd check the joins, the trestles. He'd show me how it all held together, how the stress was balanced. I used to trace the grain of the wood. It felt so strong, so permanent." Her fingers, now gloved, traced a massive beam. Her knowledge, born of love, had become their weapon. While she scouted the underside, Jonah moved to the boxcar. The door was padlocked, but the hasp was set in new wood. He used the flat end of his skinning knife, leveraging it against the screws. The wood was soft pine. It gave way with a low groan. He slid the door back, inch by agonizing inch, the sound lost in the sigh of the wind rising from the cut. Inside, the smell of dynamite was overwhelming. Crates, stacked 5 high, Western Meridian Rail Company. Danger. Near the door were 2 smaller, reinforced boxes, detonators. He didn't have time to sabotage the whole car. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to let Bragg walk into his own trap. But Jonah was a scout. A good scout always has a second way out. He located the main bundle of fuses Bragg's men would have set. He traced them back, finding the primary charge meant to sever the main supports. Then, working quickly in the dark, he took a length of his own slow-burning fuse from his saddlebag. He found an old, empty drill hole in one of the main support beams, a relic from the bridge's construction. He jammed his fuse deep inside, then packed it with rock dust. He attached a single blasting cap, leading the wire back to the boxcar, hiding it under a pile of construction debris. It was a diversion, a delay, a desperate last-ditch insurance policy. He then moved to the 2 crates of detonators. They were wired for a central plunger, but each crate had its own fail-safe heavy, brass safety pins that would have to be removed before they could be armed. Jonah jammed the pins in harder, bending the ends of the soft metal with his knife, making them impossible to pull out quickly. He closed the boxcar door, leaving it unsecured. He slipped back into the shadows of the scaffolding, finding Rose. She was perched on a crossbeam, looking out at the dark, empty expanse of the North Rim.
"Anything,"
Jonah whispered, his breath pluming.
"No, not yet,"
she said, her voice tight with a desperate, fragile hope.
"No white light. Alma, she should be there by now."
"Vaughn's a hard man to move. She'll get it done." He put his hand on her shoulder, a brief, solid pressure. "They're coming." He had heard it first, a sound that was less a sound and more a vibration, felt through the soles of his boots, the rhythmic, steady beat of horses, walking. They pressed themselves into the deepest shadows, under the main platform of the siding. 4 riders materialized from the darkness. The first was Sheriff Pike Alderman, his bulk overflowing his saddle, his badge catching a sliver of moonlight. He was followed by 3 deputies, hard-faced men Jonah didn't recognize, their rifles already out of their scabbards. The last man was not a rider. He was a statement. Deacon Silas Bragg sat his horse like it was a church pew, rigid and righteous. He wore a fine, black frock coat, his starched white collar a beacon in the gloom. He dismounted with a stiff, proprietary air. As his foot touched the ground, the light from Pike's lantern glinted off the mirror shine of his polished city shoes. He looked at the mud with disdain, then strode to the boxcar. "Sheriff, please provide some light," Bragg commanded, his voice as thin and sharp as his smile. He pulled a ledger book from inside his coat. A deputy brought a lantern closer. Bragg compared the number on the boxcar, 4012 to the number in his book. He slid the door open. He didn't go inside. He just counted the crates he could see, his finger running down the manifest. "It all seems to be in order," Bragg said, closing the book with a satisfied snap. "The manifest matches, maintenance supplies for the Z-Bridge, all perfectly accounted for." "Good," Pike grunted, swinging down from his horse. "Then let's get this over with. I don't like this place. It's a long drop." "Patience, Sheriff," Bragg said, that knife-edge smile playing on his lips. "Precision is everything. My men set the charges this afternoon. All we must do is connect the primary detonators and, test the integrity of the bridge. Such a tragedy, but necessary for progress." He motioned to his deputies. "Arm the detonators. I want this done in the next 10 minutes. Rose's hand gripped Jonah's arm. Her knuckles were white. "No light?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Jonah, there's no light. Alma, she didn't make it." "Then we go to plan 2, Jonah whispered back, his hand moving to the hilt of his knife. "No." Rose's voice was suddenly terribly calm. Abel said he showed me how it all held together. He showed me so I could be strong." Before Jonah could react, she moved. She didn't climb. She emerged. She stepped out from under the bridge, onto the main track, standing between the men and the boxcar. She was a specter, her hair wild from the wind, her oversized coat flapping, the lantern light catching the furious, tear-bright glitter in her eyes. The men froze. Pike's jaw dropped. Bragg's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, reptilian shock. Rose's hand went to her throat, but not to the rope mark. She pulled the dented silver locket free, holding it up. It swung in the lantern light. A small, silver pendulum. "Deacon Bragg," she said, her voice not loud, but clear, carrying in the cold, still air. "You signed this. You signed for 50 detonators." She held up the ledger page. "You used them to destroy the Chamizal well, and now you're here to finish the job." For a full second, the only sound was the wind in the ravine. Pike was the first to move, his training, or his panic, taking over. His hand blurred as he drew his revolver. "It's her, get her, she's the one." He raised the gun to fire. Crack! The sound was not from Pike's gun. It was Jonah's Spencer. His shot was perfect. He hadn't aimed at Pike. He had aimed at the lantern in the deputy's hand. The bullet shattered the glass. The lantern exploded in a small, bright flash, and then the world was plunged into a near-total, disorienting darkness. "Rose, move," Jonah roared. Chaos erupted. The deputies, blind, yelled in confusion. Pike fired his revolver into the black. The muzzle flash, a terrifying, temporary sun, illuminating their panicked faces. The bullet screamed off a steel rail, inches from Jonah's head. Jonah lunged, grabbing Rose, pulling her back into the maze of scaffolding just as another shot tore through the space where she had been. "Spread out," Bragg shrieked, his voice cracking with rage. Find them both. They can't be allowed to leave here." A deputy, scrambling backward in the dark, his eyes useless, tripped over a pile of loose ties. He stumbled, his arms windmilling, and with a choked, high-pitched scream, he fell from the bridge, vanishing into the black void. The sound of his scream went on, until it was suddenly, horribly, cut short. The remaining men froze. "Hold your fire," Pike bellowed, his voice shaking. "Hold your fire.
Light a torch! Light a damn torch!
Into this sudden, tense silence, a new voice spoke. It was a cold, dry drawl, and it came from the head of the bridge, from the only way out. I'd advise against that. Sheriff! A match flared. Not a torch, but a small, steady flame, cupped in a gloved hand. It rose, illuminating the face of Lyle Creed. He sat on his horse, blocking the trail, his Winchester held loose. Its muzzle pointed at the ground, halfway between Bragg's men and the shadows where Jonah and Rose were hiding.
Creed, Pike snarled. What the hell are you doing here? Get 'em. They're in the beams. The bounty's yours.
I'm here for a bounty. Sheriff, Creed said, his voice dangerously calm as he lit a cigarillo, the cherry glowing red in the dark. I ain't here to take the blame for a railroad war, and I ain't here to get shot in the back by a panicked deputy in the dark. He took a slow pull from the cigarillo. This has gotten complicated and expensive. My price just went up. You're working with them, Bragg accused, stepping forward. I ain't working with anyone. Creed snapped. I'm a businessman, and right now, this looks like a bad investment. You, Deacon, you're trying to blow a bridge. You, Pike, you're trying to kill a woman who ain't been tried. And you, he motioned with his rifle toward the shadows. You're just trouble. I'm trying to figure out which one of you is worth the paper. Rose's voice, clear and strong, cut through the dark from her hiding place. Are you, Mr. Creed, are you a businessman? I am, ma'am, he drawled, surprised. Then what's this worth? Something small and dark and heavy flew through the air. Glinting once, it landed in the dust just in front of Creed's horse. What in the Pike started? It's the spike, Rose called out. The one my husband gave me. Read the number on it. Mr. Creed. Read it out loud. Creed leaned down from his saddle, the red glow of his cigarillo illuminating the object. He nudged it with his boot, then slowly dismounted. He kept his rifle in one hand, and with the other, he picked up the railroad spike. He held it close to his face. For a long, tense moment, he was silent. The men on the bridge watched him, their own lanterns now being relit, casting a shaky, uncertain glow. 40.12Z, Creed read, his voice losing its drawl, becoming sharp, focused. Well, I'll be... What is it? Pike demanded. It's just a spike. No, it ain't, Sheriff, Creed said, looking up, his eyes invisible under his hat, but his voice full of a new, cold understanding. This is a surveyor's marker, and I know exactly where it is. It's the old, hidden Redwater cache, the one every bounty hunter and outlaw in this territory avoids, because it's packed to the gills with enough black powder and dynamite to level a town. He looked toward Bragg. This ain't just about a bridge. This is about a private army, a private arsenal. The truth hung in the air, heavy and toxic as the dynamite itself. Creed had been a hunter. Now, he was a witness. His hesitation was palpable. He had come for a woman, and he had found a conspiracy that could get him killed or make him rich, while all eyes were on Creed. Jonas saw the movement. Bragg, his face a mask of pale, sweating fury, had slipped back to the boxcar. He wasn't trying to arm the main detonators. He knew Jonah had been there. He was pulling a secondary, smaller charge, a backup fuse. He's lighting it, Jonah roared. Bragg had the fuse in his hand, striking a match. If I can't have this bridge, no one can. Rose didn't hesitate. She burst from the scaffolding, her small body a blur of motion. She wasn't running from him. She was running at him. She launched herself at the deacon, grabbing the detonation cord in his hand, yanking it with all her strength. The match fell. The cord came free. But Bragg, in a fit of pure, animalistic rage, swung his arm backhand. His fist, heavy with a gold signet ring, caught her square across the face. The sound was a sickening thwack. She was thrown backward, flying off her feet, her head striking the steel rail. She lay still, a small, dark heap in the lantern light. Jonah saw red. He moved from the shadows, not as a scout, but as an executioner. He left his rifle. He had only his knife. But Pike was there, between him and Rose, the sheriff. His fear finally mastered, his authority reasserted, stood on the dew-slick rails, his revolver level, aimed not at Jonah, but at the still form of Rose on the ground. "That's enough, Rourke," Pike panted, his voice a low, vicious growl. "Not one more step. You move. She's the one who pays." Jonah stopped. He stood 10 feet from the sheriff, his knife in his hand, his chest heaving. The ravine wind whipped his hair, his coat. They faced each other on the narrow steel track. 2 shadows, 2 pasts. The lawman who had sold his soul, and the soldier who was trying to get his back. "It's over," Pike said, his gun unwavering. "It's all over." And then, from the north rim, a voice. "Sheriff Alderman, you are mistaken." It was Alma Finch, and as her voice echoed across the cut, a single, bright white lantern flared to life, hanging from the blasted pine on the cliff edge, a beacon of impossible, blinding hope. That single white light hung from the blasted pine on the north rim was a star of impossible judgment. It cut through the darkness, pure and unwavering, silencing the chaos on the bridge. Every eye, Pike's, Bragg's, Creed's, and Jonah's, snapped toward it. "Sheriff Alderman, you are mistaken, Doctor." Alma Finch's voice echoed across the ravine, sharp and powerful, a scalpel slicing through the tension. "You are interfering with a federal investigation convened by the authority of this territory." Behind her, stumbling out of the darkness, his face a mask of purple fury, was a large, imposing man in a rumpled suit. Judge Ernest Vaughn. He was a man of books and benches, not cliffsides, and he was breathing heavily, his hat in his hand. Alma, it was clear, had not so much persuaded him as dragged him here. "What is the meaning of this circus?" Vaughn boomed, his voice a gavel. "Doctor, you bring me to this precipice in the dead of night." "The meaning, Judge," Alma called back, her voice ringing with authority, "is that you are standing in the middle of a crime scene, and the perpetrators are on that bridge." On the rim around them, more lights were appearing. Torches, lanterns, the sound of hoofbeats and murmuring voices. Alma hadn't just brought the judge. She had brought witnesses. They were the people of the basin, rousted from their beds by the doctor's furious ride. Bridge hands from the construction camp, their faces grim. Cattlemen, their hats in their hands, their eyes hard. Jonah saw Maribel Ortega, the saloon keeper from Sagebrush Ferry. Her arms crossed, her face set. These were not random citizens. They were the people who had lost their wells, the people whose livestock had strayed, the people who had been slowly, inexorably strangled by Deacon Bragg's progress. They were a jury of the aggrieved. Pike Alderman's face went pale. He was no longer a sheriff controlling a dark road. He was a defendant in a courtroom with no walls, his gun still aimed at Rose. "Judge Vaughn," Pike stammered, his bravado gone. "This is a simple matter of law. I am arresting a fugitive, Rosamond Hale, for the murder of her husband. These people are obstructing me." "Then you will be pleased to present your evidence." "Sheriff," Judge Vaughn snapped, his eyes adjusting to the scene. "As will this woman. By the authority vested in me, I declare this a territorial hearing. The Court of the Plains is now in session." Jonah didn't hesitate. He kept his body between Pike and Rose, but he stooped, his hands gentle, and helped her to her feet. She was dazed, the side of her face already swelling from Bragg's blow. But she was alive. Her eyes found the white lantern, and she stood straighter. "The evidence is clear." Alma Finch shouted from the rim, "I have it here. My sworn affidavit as County Coroner Abel Hale was not killed by his wife. He was struck from behind, his skull fractured. And then he was improperly suspended to suggest a false cause of death. She held up the paper, the judge's lantern illuminating it. Furthermore, I have examined Rosamond Hale. The marks on her neck are not from a struggle. They are from a flat, heavy strap applied from behind, as an instrument of restraint and silencing. Lies, Bragg hissed, his composure cracking, his black coat flapping. A bitter woman's fantasies. Then, is this a fantasy? Deacon, Alma shot back. She produced the ledger page. Your signature authorizing payment for 50 detonators on the precise day the Chamizal well was destroyed. A well, Judge, that supplied half a dozen ranches you have since offered to buy for pennies on the dollar. The murmur from the crowd on the rim grew into a low, angry growl. And what of that? Jonah's voice cut through, and he pointed a steady, accusing finger at the boxcar. Listed as maintenance supplies. I asked the court to demand the county work order. I guarantee there isn't one, because that car is full of the same dynamite he was going to use to blow this bridge and starve out the settlers on the Mesa Verde. This is an outrage, Pike yelled, his gun wavering. He was losing control. This isn't law. This is a mob. I am the ordained peacekeeper here. I am restoring order. Your order, Sheriff, seems to involve pointing a loaded weapon at a victim, Judge Vaughn said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. Under territorial statute, a circuit judge may convene a hearing anywhere a clear and present danger to the populace exists. And I see a boxcar full of dynamite and a guilty man's panic. I'd call that a clear and present danger. Vaughn looked at Pike's two remaining deputies, who were frozen in a state of terrified indecision. You two secure that boxcar. It is now evidence. Take the sheriff's weapon. The deputies looked at Pike. They looked at the angry crowd on the rim. They looked at the federal judge. Their loyalty, thin as it was, snapped. One of them slowly reached out and put his hand on the barrel of Pike's gun, pushing it toward the ground. Pike, defeated, let him take it. Vaughn's eyes scanned the bridge, finally landing on the one man who didn't belong. And you, sir, he called out to Lyle Creed, who was still sitting on his horse, a silent observer. What is your business in this proceeding? Creed took a slow pull from his cigarillo, the red tip glowing. He had watched his $80 bounty and his much larger disappearance fee evaporate. He was a businessman, and the market had just crashed. It was time to cut his losses and invest in the winning side. He dismounted, holding the heavy railroad spike in his hand. My business was her, he said, nodding to Rose. A fugitive, or so I was told. He walked forward and tossed the spike. It landed at Deacon Bragg's polished, immaculate feet with a dull thud. But my business just changed, Creed continued, his voice carrying clearly. That spike, number 40.12Z. It ain't just a marker. It's the location of the Redwater cache. An illegal arms dump. Judge, more dynamite in one place than the U.S. Army has west of the Mississippi. I've been a bounty hunter in this territory for 10 years. We all know the stories. We all know to avoid it. We never knew who owned it. He looked at Bragg, his unseen eyes seeming to pierce the man. Until now, that spike, it proves her story. All of it. It was the final nail. The medical proof, the financial link, the physical evidence. And now, the corroboration of a known, neutral, and dangerous third party. Judge Vaughn's face was thunder. Deacon Silas Bragg, I am ordering you and your men taken into custody on suspicion of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal transport of explosives, and public endangerment. Sheriff Pike Alderman, you are suspended. I am hereby appointing Mr. Creed as a temporary agent of this court. You will hand him your badge, now. Pike, his face gray, unpinned the simple tin star. For Deacon Bragg, the world had ended. His name, his power, his railroad, all of it, gone. He was a man of paper and money, and his paper had betrayed him. His money was useless. He looked at the judge. He looked at the angry faces on the rim. He looked at Rose, standing beside Jonah. And he snapped. "No," he whispered. "No, you won't. You won't." He was not a gunman. He was a coward. He didn't reach for his own weapon. With a speed born of pure animal panic, he lunged sideways, snatching the revolver from the holster of the deputy closest to him. He didn't aim at Vaughn. He didn't aim at Rose. He didn't even aim at Jonah. He aimed at the symbol, at the one pure white light that had condemned him. "No court!" he screamed, and he fired at the white lantern on the north rim. The shot was wild. It missed the lantern, but the bullet's crack and the muzzle flash sent the crowd on the rim scattering, screaming in panic. Bragg, his arm flailing, his eyes wide with madness, turned his hand back toward the bridge, back toward the mass of people, his finger tightening on the trigger for a second. Random shot. Jonah didn't think. He didn't plan. His body moved, a pure scout's instinct. Rose was still dazed, standing exposed. He threw himself in front of her, his body a shield, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her down. The second shot rang out. Jonah felt it. Not a hard impact, but a sudden, searing line of fire across his left shoulder. It was as if a hot poker had been laid against his skin and then ripped away. The bullet had torn through the thick leather of his coat and the muscle beneath, exiting cleanly. It was a graze, but a deep one. He grunted, the force of it spinning him, but he didn't fall. He held on to Rose, his legs braced. He could feel the instant hot wetness of his own blood soaking his shirt. On the bridge, the night, which had been held in a state of suspended animation, finally broke. Bragg's two deputies, their masters either disarmed or insane, were now just two men, facing a dozen angry, righteous ranchers and bridge hands who had just watched them try to murder a woman and a judge. It was not a fight, it was a tide. Maribel Ortega, her face a mask of fury, led the charge. The bridge hands surged forward. The deputies were overwhelmed, thrown to the planks, their weapons ripped from their hands. Bragg, his gun empty, was seized, his fine black coat torn from his back, his screams of rage turning to high example of, "Get your hands off me, do you know who I am?" The night, balanced on a knife's edge for so long, had finally, completely, fallen into justice, and it was ringing. The roar of the crowd on the rim was a physical thing, a wave of sound that washed over the bridge. Bragg was screaming, his curses lost as the bridge hands, their face hard with a cold, righteous fury, dragged him toward the deputies. Pike Alderman stood frozen, his badge gone, his face a mask of gray, defeated sweat. Judge Vaughn was already shouting orders from the rim, his voice carrying the full, booming weight of the law. And in that sudden, chaotic swell of justice, no one but Jonah heard it. A hiss. It was a small, insistent sound, like a snake in the dust. He had felt the vibration a split second before, a faint tremor through the planking. His eyes snapped to the boxcar. From the pile of construction debris where he had hidden his insurance policy, a thin, lazy spiral of gray smoke was rising. The fuse, his own diversionary fuse, the one he'd jammed into the old drill hole. In the chaos of the fight, a stray spark from Pike's gun, from the shattered lantern, must have found it. It was burning, and it was burning straight toward the single blasting cap he had attached. The cap meant to delay, not to destroy, but it was tied into the main support beam. The bridge was still going to blow. "The fuse!" Jonah roared, his voice cutting through the cheers. But the crowd didn't understand. They were celebrating. Fire, get back. He grabbed Rose, pushing her toward the head of the bridge. "Rose, run! Get to the bank!" "What?" she cried, her face, bruised and swelling, turned to his. "The bridge. It's going to go." He shoved her, hard, And then he turned and ran, not off the bridge, but toward the boxcar. The pain in his shoulder, which had been a dull, hot throb, exploded into a searing, white-hot agony. The bullet graze had torn him deep. He felt the hot, slick wetness of his own blood running down his arm, soaking his shirt. A wave of dizziness, cold and sudden, made the trestles spin. He staggered, catching himself on a rail, his head swimming. He couldn't. He was too slow. "Jonah!" He heard her scream, but it wasn't from the bank. It was from behind him. Rose hadn't run. She had turned, her eyes wide with terror, and run after him. In her hands, she was dragging her heavy, oversized cloak, the one she had worn for 2 days. It was still damp from the storm. She flew past him, her small body fueled by a desperate, final surge of adrenaline. She reached the hissing fuse line first and threw the heavy, damp cloak over it, smothering the burning end. But the fuse was long. The spark had already traveled, disappearing into the dark. Sawdust-choked drill hole in the main support beam. It's inside the wood," she gasped, pulling the cloak back, her hands raw. The hiss was still there, muffled, deep inside the beam. Jonah was beside her, his knife in his hand. He was gritting his teeth, the world narrowing to a single, spinning point of pain. "The cap," he panted, his breath sobbing in his chest. "I have to cut it." He fell to his knees, his left arm useless, and began digging at the packed rock dust with his knife, his right hand shaking from the strain. The smoke was thicker now, pouring from the hole. "I can't reach it," he grunted, the dizzy spell returning. "Here." Rose was on her knees beside him, her face inches from his, her eyes clear and focused. The terror burned away and replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Show me." "The wire," he gasped. "A thin copper wire inside. Cut it." She jammed her own small, gloved hands into the hole, pulling at the debris he had loosened. He held the lantern, his arm shaking so badly the light danced. The smoke stung their eyes, the smell of sulfur and burning pine filling their lungs. Their breaths came in short, panicked gasps, but they found a rhythm. Gasp, dig, gasp, dig. They were a single, four-handed, desperate machine. "I feel it," she cried. "A wire." Pull it out." She wrapped her fingers around it and yanked, gritting her teeth. A thin copper wire, attached to the ugly brass cylinder of the blasting cap, came free. "Cut it, Jonah, cut it now." He brought his knife down, sawing at the thin wire, his vision blurring. At that exact moment, the night, which had already given so much violence, gave one last desperate lurch. Deacon Bragg, in the grasp of 2 bridge hands, had been watching, seeing his last chance at destruction being stolen. He had become a madman. With a scream of pure animalistic fury, he bit down, hard, on the hand of the man holding his arm. The man yelled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Bragg needed. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He had a small, thin knife, a boot knife, that they had all missed. He lunged, not at the crowd, but at the 2 people who had destroyed him. He lunged for Rose's back. He never made it. Crack! The shot was deafeningly loud, flat and professional. It was not the chaotic boom of Pike's revolver. It was the sharp, clean report of Creed's Winchester. Deacon Bragg screamed, a high, thin sound, and collapsed, clutching his right hand. The boot knife clattered to the planks. Creed had not missed. The bullet had gone clean through the center of Bragg's palm, shattering the bones, pinning his hand to the wooden tie he had fallen against. Creed racked his rifle. The sound a definitive, metallic full stop. He walked his horse forward, the crowd parting before him. He looked down at the writhing, screaming Deacon. "Sorry, Deacon," Creed drawled, his voice bored. "Changed my mind about my fee. I'm arresting the man with the higher price. And a man on trial for murder and conspiracy, well, he's worth a whole lot more alive than a dead fugitive. You're my bounty now. The entire drama, the fuse, the knife. The shot had taken less than 10 seconds. And in that 10 seconds, Pike Alderman, the gray, defeated coward, had seen his one and only chance. While every eye was on Bragg, while Jonah and Rose were bent over the smoking fuse, Pike had simply dissolved. He slipped from the knot of deputies, silent as a shadow, and vaulted over the side of the bridge. Not into the ravine, but onto the steep, rubble-strewn scree slope that led down into the gully. Jonah, his knife still in his hand, the severed wire in his fist, saw the movement. He saw the shadow disappearing into the black. Pike, a rage, older and darker than anything he felt for Bragg, surged through him. This was not about land. This was not about dynamite. This was about a man in a barn, a brother's scream, a failure that had defined his entire life. Pike was a man who let others burn. "Rose, stay here," he growled. He got to his feet, his wounded shoulder screaming, but he ignored it. He grabbed his Spencer, where he had left it, and launched himself over the side of the bridge, sliding down the scree slope in a shower of gravel. The chase was short, brutal, and silent. Pike was a man soft from graft, running in panic. Jonah was a scout, fueled by a lifetime of grief, his boots finding purchase on the loose rock as if by instinct. The only sound was Pike's ragged, sobbing breaths and the steady, rhythmic slap, slap, slap of Jonah's boots behind him, echoing off the narrow, towering stone walls of the gully. Jonah ran him down in less than a minute. He didn't tackle him. He just appeared. As Pike scrambled around a massive boulder, Jonah was simply there, standing in his path, his Spencer held at his hip. Pike fell, collapsing onto the rocks, crab-walking backward until his back hit the cold, sheer wall of the canyon. No, please, Rourke," he whimpered, holding his hands up. "Don't I? I'll testify, I'll tell him everything, Bragg. He made me, Jonah just looked at him. The man's face was a pale, sweating moon in the darkness. He was pathetic, a coward, a man who would trade any soul, any promise, to save his own skin. Jonah raised the rifle. He leveled it at Pike's chest. His finger found the trigger, the cold, smooth curve of the metal. He thought of Matthew. He thought of the barn, the smell of smoke, the sound of his brother's voice screaming his name, and the awful, final silence. One pull, one squeeze, and it would be over. The scales would be balanced, blood for blood. He saw Pike's eyes, wide and wet with terror, saw his lips quiver as he tried to form a prayer. And Jonah, he saw himself, a man standing in the dark, about to trade one ghost for another. He had come here for justice, not for vengeance. He had come here to save a life, not to take another. He saw Rose's face, her hand reaching for his in the storm shed. He heard her voice. "You look at me like I'm a person." He would not become the thing he hunted. Slowly, his finger relaxed. He lowered the rifle. "You're right," Jonah said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "You will testify." He unslung the coil of rope from his saddle horn, which he still wore over his good shoulder. Pike didn't move as Jonah, with grim, practiced efficiency, trussed him up, tying his hands and feet. "You'll tell them everything," Jonah said, finishing the knot. "And you'll live with it. That's a penance Matthew would have understood." He left Pike there, a pathetic bundle in the dark, and climbed back up to the bridge. The scene was transformed. The white lantern still shone from the rim. The crowd, their anger spent, was a quiet, murmuring mass. Creed was tying a bandage around Bragg's bleeding hand, treating his bounty with a rough, proprietary care. Rose was standing where he had left her, by the smoking, severed fuse. As he climbed back over the rail, her eyes found his. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't have to. She just looked at his empty hands, at the rifle resting peacefully in the crook of his arm. And she knew. A sound, a great, collective exhalation, rose from the crowd. The bridge was safe. The villains were caught. The cheer that went up was ragged, but it was full of a desperate, joyous relief. Rose didn't cheer. She just stood, her hand over her mouth, and let out a single, shuddering sigh that seemed to empty her of the last 3 days of terror. Her relief was not for the bridge, it was for him. The construction shed was 20 yards from the bridge, a small, lean-to shack that smelled of fresh-cut pine, sawdust, and axle grease. Jonah stumbled into it, the adrenaline finally gone, leaving nothing but a vast, empty ocean of pain. His left side was on fire, and the world was tilting. He collapsed onto a pile of canvas tarps, his rifle clattering to the floor. Jonah Rose was right behind him, closing the door, shutting out the noise of the crowd. She fumbled with the storm lantern, her hands shaking, and lit it. The small, warm light filled the shed. He was slumped against the wall, his head back, his eyes closed, his face pale as ash. The entire left side of his shirt was a dark, glistening black. "Oh, heavens," she whispered. She grabbed his canteen from his belt and a tin cup from a worker's shelf. She found a bundle of clean rags, meant for polishing tools. She knelt beside him. Jonah, I have to see it." He just grunted, his eyes barely opening. This is going to hurt," she said, her voice trembling. She took his knife from his belt, carefully, her fingers clumsy. She cut the thick, bloody fabric of his shirt, peeling it away from the wound. It was a deep, raw, open channel, running from the top of his shoulder back toward his shoulder blade. It was bleeding, a steady, dark ooze. "Thank God," she breathed. It went through. It went clean through." She poured water onto a rag. This will be cold." He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his whole body tensing as the cold water hit the raw, open wound. I know, I'm sorry," she murmured, her hands gentle but firm. She cleaned the wound, her movements becoming more confident. She washed away the blood, the dirt, the powder burns, and as she worked, the tears she had held back for 3 days finally came. They weren't tears of fear. They were tears of gratitude, of sheer, overwhelming relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a broken sob as she wiped the grime from his skin. "Oh, Jonah, thank you." She poured more water, cleaning the entry and exit wounds. You saved me in the night." She packed the wounds with clean wadding, as she had seen Dr. Finch do once for a ranch hand. You believed me when no one?" "Rose," he mumbled, his good hand finding her arm. "No, let me," she said, her tears dripping onto his skin, mixing with the water. She began to wrap the wound, tightly, with strips of clean canvas, creating a thick pressure bandage. You came after me on the bridge. You saved us. She finished the knot, her hands tight. She had cleaned his wound. She had bandaged him, and he was alive. She looked at his face, his eyes now open, watching her, the pain sharp, but his gaze clear. She put her hands on either side of his face, her palms cool against his rough, stubbled skin. "And you let him go?" she whispered, her voice full of a sudden, profound awe. "Down in the gully, you let him go." He said nothing. He just watched her. She leaned in, her entire body shaking, and pressed her forehead against his. His skin was hot, feverish. His good arm came up, his hand tangling in her wild, dirty hair, holding her to him. They stayed like that, 2 broken, breathing people in a shed that smelled of pine. Her hand moved from his face, her fingers finding his. They interlaced, his rough, calloused palm gripping her small, strong one. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the desperate, cold kiss in the storm. This one was slow, it was warm, it was a promise, It started gentle, a soft press of lips, a sigh of shared air, and deepened into a powerful, quiet flame. It was a kiss of searing relief, of profound gratitude, of a future that, just 1 hour ago, had not existed. It was the kiss of two survivors who had found something far more important than just safety. They pulled apart, but only inches. They were still breathing the same air, their foreheads touching, their hands locked together, the old, greasy canvas tarp beneath them, the rough coats they had huddled in. The smell of sawdust. It was not a palace. It was a home. They didn't need to say the words. The promise was already made, sealed in the shared, smoky air. In the grip of their hands, they would rebuild. The bridge, the town, their lives, together. The sun rose over the eastern rim of Coyote Cut, a slow, merciless blade of light that cut through the shadows. It struck the high, blasted pine, illuminating the white lantern that now hung, extinguished, its glass cold. The symbol of justice had done its work. The night was over. On the bridge, the air was cold and thin, smelling of dust, pine, and the faint, sick-sweet smell of black powder. The court of the plains had been swift, brutal, and binding. Judge Ernest Vaughn, his face a mask of grim duty, had not waited for a proper courtroom. He used an upturned crate as a desk, the ink freezing in its well as he scribbled. He signed the transfer warrant, his signature a series of angry black scratches. Deacon Silas Bragg, his hand crudely bandaged by Dr. Finch, his fine coat stained with his own blood in the dirt of the bridge, was no longer a pillar of the community. He was cargo. "Mr. Creed," Vaughn said, his voice raw in the dawn air. Lyle Creed, who had been quietly smoking his cigarillo, stepped forward. He looked at the warrant. "This just gets him to the county seat. Judge." "Indeed," Vaughn said, "but my wire to the territorial capital will get a Marshal. This is a federal matter now. Railroads, interstate commerce, conspiracies, this is far beyond a county sheriff." "Good," Creed said. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at Bragg. "Because I'm not turning him over to the county. I'm taking him to the railroad, the Western Meridian Board in Denver. They'll pay a considerable fee for the privilege of handling their own rogue agent before the marshals get him." Bragg looked up, his face a mask of new, dawning horror. He was not being sent to jail. He was being sent home, as a failure and a liability. Creed smiled. A thin, cold crescent in the morning light. "It's the highest bounty. Deacon, just like I said." He nudged Bragg with his rifle. "On your feet. We ride." As they moved off, Pike Alderman remained. He was a gray, slumped thing, his hands still tied. The fight completely gone from him. Judge Vaughn looked down at him, not with anger, but with a weary, profound contempt. "Sheriff Alderman," he said, "the bridge hands, the ranchers, Maribel Ortega, they all gathered. They formed a silent, tight circle. I find you derelict in your duty, complicit in conspiracy, and an accessory to murder," Vaughn declared, his voice echoing in the quiet. "By my authority, I strip you of your office." He didn't take the badge himself. He nodded to the deputy who had first taken Pike's gun. The young man, his face pale, stepped forward. He did not rip the tin star from Pike's chest. He unpinned it, slowly, the small click of the pin coming free, sounding as loud as a gunshot in the silence. He held it in his palm, a tarnished, worthless piece of metal. Pike was cut loose. "Get on your horse," the deputy said, his voice flat. Pike stumbled to his feet. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Maribel, whose saloon he had used as a trap. He looked at the ranchers whose wells he had let Bragg destroy. He was waiting for the rocks, for the ropes, for the yelling. It never came. They just watched him. Their gaze was a physical weight, cold, heavy, and unforgiving. They didn't need to shout. Their silence was his sentence. It was the civilized, terrible vengeance of a community that had taken its power back. Pike mounted his horse, a broken, empty man, and rode away, not as a lawman, but as a pariah, banished by the cold, clear eyes of the people he had betrayed. Dr. Alma Finch had taken Jonah and Rose to her small clinic in Bitter Willow, a clean, sharp-smelling room behind the town's main mercantile. The sun was high and warm now, streaming through the window. Alma had just finished stitching Jonah's shoulder, her movements quick, practiced, and far from gentle. "You are a fool, Jonah Rourke," she said, pulling the last thread tight. He grunted, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the examination cot. "Running around in a canyon with a hole in your back, you're lucky you didn't sever an artery." "I'm fine, Alma," he gritted out. "No, you're not. You're wounded, and you're tired. But you'll live." She turned her sharp, bird-like gaze on Rose, who sat on a stool, a cup of hot, sweet tea steaming in her hands. The bruise on her face was a dark, ugly purple, but her eyes were clear. "And you, child," Alma said, her voice softening. "What's next for you?" Rose looked down into her cup. The question hung in the room, heavier than the smell of carbolic. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a vast, hollow emptiness. Her home was gone. Her husband was gone. Her name was ruined. I don't know," she whispered. "I have no home. I can't stay." "Why not?" Alma snapped. "The whispers," Rose said, her voice trembling. They'll still say it. The woman who was accused. The husband killer. I can't face that." Alma snorted, tossing a bloody rag into a basin. Whispers are just hot air from empty people. You let them whisper. You know what I heard this morning. When I was buying this tea, they're not calling you the husband killer. You know what they're calling you." Rose looked up, her eyes wide. "They're calling you the bridge saver. They're calling you the woman who faced down Bragg. You stood on that trestle, child, and you held up that ledger page. You gave this town its spine back. Let them whisper. You just hold your head up higher." Alma moved to a small, cluttered desk. "Besides, you can't leave. I need a secretary. My books are a disaster. I can't read my own handwriting, and I need someone to help me mix poultices. I'll pay you $1 a day, plus room and board behind the clinic." She paused, looking at Rose over the top of her spectacles. "And the schoolhouse, it's been empty for a year. The children there running wild, forgetting their letters. They need someone to teach them the alphabet. A room, a warm room, a slate, some chalk, just a place to learn again. Seems to me, a woman who understands numbers and stitches might be just the person." Rose stared at her, speechless. A job, a purpose, a place. Jonah sat up, easing his arm into the sling Alma had made. He looked at Rose, at the hope warring with fear in her eyes. He knew what it was to be trapped by whispers, even if his were all in his own head. He cleared his throat. It's a good offer. Rose." Her eyes met his. A new, uncertain future was opening up, a path she had never imagined. A few days later, Jonah stood at the fence of his corral at the Lone Spur Ranch. The silence was back, but it was different. It was not the heavy, oppressive weight of solitude. It was the clean, clear quiet of the high desert. His shoulder ached, a good, clean pain that reminded him he was alive. He looked at the corral rail. His heavy stock saddle was slung over it. Next to it was the lighter breaking saddle he had put on the mare. Comet, the mare he had retrieved from Sagebrush Ferry. 2 saddles, the rail, which had looked so long and empty for 5 years, now seemed balanced. Rose rode up the trail, leading a small mule borrowed from Alma. She had been staying at the clinic, helping, her mind buzzing with lists of herbs and the simple, clean lines of alphabet charts. She dismounted, her movements sure now, confident. The bruise on her face had faded to a pale, yellowish green.
"How's the shoulder?" she asked, her voice calm, easy.
"It holds," he said. He nodded toward the corral. "They're fine horses. Strong, the dun. Dusty, he's the best I've ever bred. You're not."
"I'm selling them,"
he said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the horses.
"Half the herd. Selling them to the Army remount station at Fort Grant. It'll bring a good price."
Rose was confused.
"But the ranch, they're your livelihood."
"Part of it," he said. He finally turned to her.
I was at the Chamizal well this morning. The one Bragg destroyed. It's just a sinkhole. Dust. The family's there, they're hauling water 10 miles.
He kicked at the dirt. "A man I knew a long time ago, he used to say that a man isn't defined by what he breaks. He's defined by what he builds. I've been breaking for a long time. Rose, hiding. It's time to build."
"What are you building?"
she asked, her voice soft.
"A new well,"
he said, his voice rough. "For the Chamizal folks. The money from the horses, it'll pay for the dynamite. The right kind, this time. And the timber. We can dig a new public well, deeper than the old one. One that Bragg's ghost can't touch." He was atoning, not just for the community, but for Matthew. He was finally coming back from the war. Rose looked at him, at this hard, quiet man who was selling his past to buy a future for people he barely knew. And she felt a love so deep, so profound. It ached. That Saturday night, the entire town of Bitter Willow was at Maribel's saloon. It was not a celebration, but a regathering, a collective breath. Jonah and Rose walked in together. The saloon, which had been buzzing with conversation, fell dead silent. A man in the corner, playing a mandolin, fumbled a chord, the notes dying with a sour twang. Every eye was on them. On Jonah, his arm in a clean white sling, his face hard. On Rose, her face clean, her hair pinned up, wearing a simple blue calico dress Alma had found for her. Rose's hand, which had been resting on Jonah's good arm, tightened. This was it, the whispers. Jonah didn't stop. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Maribel Ortega, who was polishing glasses behind the bar. Maribel looked at them. She looked at Jonah, the recluse, and Rose, the fugitive. She saw the set of his jaw, the quiet strength in Rose's eyes. She put down her glass, smiled, and nodded once at the mandolin player.
"Play it, Ignacio,"
she said, her voice clear.
"Play the Yellow Rose."
The music started again, hesitant at first, then gaining strength, a quiet, lovely waltz. Jonah turned to Rose.
I'm not much of a dancer. Mrs. Hale, and I've only got one good arm."
Rose looked up at him, a small, bright smile touching her lips. "And I'm wearing borrowed shoes. Mr. Rourke, I think we'll be balanced." He held out his good hand. She took it. They walked to the small, clear space on the sawdust floor. He put his hand on her waist, awkwardly. She put her hand on his good shoulder. And they danced. It was not graceful. It was a clumsy, hesitant, beautiful mess. He was stiff, guarding his wound. She kept stepping on his boot. He'd wince. She'd whisper, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he'd grunt, "It's fine." And then, after a particularly clumsy turn, where he almost sent her spinning into a table, a sound bubbled up from Rose's throat, a small, suppressed giggle. Jonah stopped, stunned. She looked up at him, her eyes wet, not with tears, but with pure, unadulterated joy. She was laughing. And Jonah Rourke, the silent scout, the hermit of Lone Spur Ranch, the man who had buried his brother in his soul, he smiled, a real, cracking, unused smile. And he laughed, a low, rough sound that turned every head in the room. The whispers were gone. There was only the mandolin, and the two of them, laughing until their eyes were wet, turning slowly and perfectly, in time with the music. That night, they rode back to the ranch. The air was warm, the desert wind a soft, gentle breath that smelled of sage and the promise of water. Rose dismounted, and Jonah led the horses to the corral. She stood on the porch, the same porch where she had arrived, a lifetime ago. He came and stood before her. The quiet of the ranch settled around them. "Well," he said, shuffling his feet, "Alma, she'll be expecting you back."
"Yes," Rose said, "she will."
They stood in the silence, the space between them suddenly a vast, empty canyon. Rose looked at the door. Then she turned, took a step, and raised her hand. She knocked. Tap, tap, tap.
3 short, quick, deliberate raps, not in terror, but in purpose.
Jonah's heart stopped. He looked at her calm, steady eyes, at the small, soft smile on her lips. He opened the door for her. The inside of the cabin was warm, the fire he'd lit earlier a low, welcoming glow. He stood in the doorway, the man who had been defined by his silence. "Rose," he said, his voice thick, desperate.
"Please don't leave me to this quiet."
She didn't answer with words. She stepped past him, over the threshold she had once collapsed upon. She turned, her small body fitting against his, and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his good shoulder. It was the embrace that paid off all the fear, all the running, all the silence. It was the answer. The Z Bridge was safe. 1 month after the night of the White Lantern. The air over Coyote Cut no longer smelled of sulfur and fear. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and new, iron-strong bolts. The railroad crews, under the grim supervision of a U.S. Marshal, had finished the work. It was a bridge, but it was also a monument. On the main support beam, where Jonah's fuse had nearly ended it all, a small, polished brass plaque was now affixed. It read, "Abel Hale." He tried to warn us. He was silenced. His name was no longer a whisper of shame, but a statement of fact. The healing of the bridge was mirrored in the valley. The auction of Deacon Bragg's seized assets, his fine horses, his imported furniture, his hidden caches had brought in a surprising sum. Judge Vaughn, in his last act before returning to the capital, decreed that the money would not go to the territory, but would be placed in a community trust, administered by Dr. Alma Finch, Maribel Ortega, and, to his great surprise, Jonah Rourke. Their first act was to build the well. Jonah had sold half his herd, but the money was no longer needed for the drilling. Instead, he used it to buy the lumber and glass for the new schoolhouse. He supervised the well digging himself, working alongside the same ranchers and bridge hands who had stormed the trestle. They didn't just drill, they dug, they blasted with a precise, controlled knowledge of dynamite that Abel Hale would have respected, and they built a well house, strong and solid, in the very center of the Chamizal Valley. When the first water came, it was a moment of profound, quiet joy. The pump handle, grasped by Jonah, squeaked. He primed it, his good arm straining, the muscles in his healed shoulder pulling tight. Then, a gasp from the pipe, a sputter of mud, and finally, a gush of cold, clear, sweet water. It splashed onto the dusty planks, a dark, spreading stain of life. The children, who had been watching from a safe, respectful distance, let out a unified cheer. They did not rush forward, but watched, their eyes wide, as the first bucket was filled and passed to Old Man Chamizal, who drank deep and wept without shame. Life began to find its new, steady rhythm. Dr. Alma Finch's clinic was now the busiest place in Bitter Willow, and its heart was Rose. She sat at a new, smooth pine desk, her handwriting, once frantic and small on a stolen ledger page, now flowing across the clinic's books, strong, clear, and confident. She logged inventories, scheduled appointments for Alma, and in the afternoons, she walked to the new schoolhouse, where the sound of children's voices reciting their letters was a sound sweeter than any music. She still wore the locket. The dent from Bragg's strike was still there, a reminder of the cost. But inside, the ledger page was gone. In its place was a new, small, tin-type photograph. It had been taken on the day the well was opened. It showed Jonah, his arm still in a sling, and Rose, her face still shadowed by the fading bruise, standing side by side next to the pump. They were not smiling. They were just standing, solid, together. The past had not been erased, but it had been answered. One hot afternoon, as Rose was sweeping the clinic's porch, a rider approached. He was a familiar, unwelcome shadow. Lyle Creed. He pulled his horse to a stop, the dust settling around him. He wasn't wearing a badge. He was back to being just a man. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable under the brim of his hat. He looked at the clean sign, Alma Finch, M. At the new chalkboard stacked by the door for the school. Rose did not flinch. She just met his gaze. Mr. Creed. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, as if calculating a bounty that no longer existed. Then, in a gesture so subtle she almost missed it, he raised two gloved fingers to the brim of his hat, a curt, respectful tip. He turned his horse and rode away. That evening, tucked into the door handle of the clinic, Rose found a small, plain envelope. Inside, there was no money, just a single sheet of paper with 3 words written in a sharp, impatient script: debt settled, L.C. The ripples of that night on the bridge spread further. A letter arrived from the territorial capital, addressed to Judge Vaughn but posted in Maribel's saloon for all to see. The Western Meridian Rail Company was now the subject of a full, state-level investigation. Bragg's confession and Pike Alderman's desperate, detailed testimony had revealed a rot that went far deeper than one bridge. The fight was not over, but for Bitter Willow. The war was, they had saved themselves. The moon was a high silver dollar, hanging over the Lone Spur Ranch. The air was cool, and for the first time, it carried the faint, damp smell of the new community, well, a mile distant. Jonah was working, his arm now free of the sling, the strength returning to his shoulder. He was not mending a fence. He was building a gate. The old, sagging gate to his ranch, the one that had witnessed her desperate arrival, was gone, stacked for firewood. He was carving a new one, from 2 thick, smooth planks of pine. He worked by lantern light, a chisel in his hand, his movements slow, careful, and full underscore of underscore a underscore new underscore purpose. He was carving a symbol into the top beam, a cluster of small, delicate flowers, their stems tough, their blossoms intricate. Larkspur, the stubborn, purple flower that found a way to bloom in the hardest, rockiest, most unforgiving soil. A flower of resilience. A flower, he had decided. That looked just like Rose. He finished the last petal, his hands aching, and walked to the barn. The barn was no longer just a stable. It was their shared space. It smelled of fresh hay, clean animals, and worn leather. Rose was there. Having just finished rubbing down Comet, it had been a long, hard day of hauling supplies for the schoolhouse, a day of shared labor, of building. She turned as he entered, a piece of clean cloth in her hand. Her face was smudged with dust, her hair escaping its braid. She smiled, a small, tired, and completely beautiful smile. He came to her, saying nothing. The silence, which he had once feared, was now a comfortable, warm blanket. He put his hands on her waist, his thumbs rubbing slow, absent circles on her hips. She leaned her head against his chest, her arms looping around his neck, and let out a long, contented sigh. They stood like that for a full minute, 2 pillars holding up the small, quiet roof of their new life. "Tired," he murmured into her hair.
"Good tired,"
she whispered back. He tilted her chin up. The kiss was long, deep, and slow. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the storm shed, born of fear. It was not the laughing, breathless kiss of the saloon, born of relief. This was a kiss of pure, quiet knowledge. It was a kiss that said, "I know you, I see you, I am here, and I am not leaving." They broke apart, but only inches. He whispered her name. "Rose," and it was a statement. She answered with his, "Jonah," and it was a promise. His calloused, strong hands moved from her waist, sliding up her arms. A touch of gentle, reassuring possession. Her hands went to his shirt, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. He covered her hands with his own, stilling them, and took over. He unbuttoned his own shirt, the one she had washed and mended, and slid it from his shoulders, revealing the puckered, angry red scar that marked his healing wound. He tossed the shirt, a careless, domestic gesture, and it landed on the horn of his saddle. He turned back to her, his hands warm on her shoulders, his eyes locked on hers. The lantern light was soft. The hay was a sweet, dry perfume. It was all warmth, all safety, all home. He held her close, his cheek against her hair. "I used to be afraid of the silence," he said, his voice low, rough with an emotion he was still learning to name. "This ranch, it was my penance, my prison. It was so quiet it was just empty." He pulled back, just enough to see her face, his gaze searching hers in the dim light. You made it feel like home." Rose put her hand on his cheek, her fingers tracing the faint, old scar from the war, a scar that matched the new one on his shoulder. "And you," she whispered, her voice thick. "You were afraid to forgive, afraid to let go of Matthew, afraid to live at all." She smiled, her eyes shining, a mirror of the tears in his own. "We chose to live. Jonah, we both did." Outside, the high desert wind blew, but it was no longer the hungry, cold wind of a world trying to break them. It was a new wind. It carried the scent of wet earth from the new well, the smell of promise. On the porch of the cabin, the memory of that fated, desperate sound still lingered in the wood. Tap, tap, tap. But it was no longer a sound of terror. It was no longer the sound of a shivering widow in the dark. It was the sound of Rose, coming in from the schoolhouse, her arms full of papers. It was the sound of Alma, arriving for supper. It was the sound of a neighbor, coming to borrow a tool, or to share a harvest. The 3 frantic knocks of midnight had become the simple, daily, welcome knocks of home. The story of that night, the lonely rancher heard a knock at midnight, the shivering widow whispered, "Please don't." It was no longer an ending. It was no longer a lament. It was just the beginning. The first hard line of a new, long and hopeful story they were finally writing together. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you enjoyed this tale, please support us by hitting the hype button, so this story can be heard by even more folks.